Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution. We got a World War III alert. If you come for the king, don't miss. Putin's pissed. Zelensky's wanted dead. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. World War III alert. I got some late breaking news the revolutionaries can use. It's war all over. Trump strikes Venezuela a couple of days ago. We got to look into that. China surrounds Taiwan. And Putin's tired of playing with NATO. They try to kill him.
Well, my dear truth seekers, the first details of the talks between Zelensky and Trump have finally appeared. As it turned out, during these negotiations in Palm Beach, the head of the Kiev regime, Volodymyr Zelensky, demanded that the United States provide Ukraine with security guarantees for a period of 50 years. According to Zelensky, Ukraine is not satisfied with the security guarantees promised by Donald Trump for a period of 15 years, with the possibility of their further extension. Furthermore, the Kiev dictator also demanded that the United States do everything to ensure that Russia agrees to a temporary ceasefire, so that he can put his so-called 20-point peace treaty to a referendum. At the same time, Zelensky admits that Russia's attitude towards holding a future referendum in Ukraine and temporarily halting hostilities is very negative. Zelensky complains that Russia continues to refuse to stop the fighting for the period that the Kiev dictator allegedly needs to prepare for a plebiscite, to approve the so-called peace plan. Well, my friends, it's fair to say that starting in 2022, Russia has always said that any truce in Ukraine is possible only after the complete withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the territories of Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions. Regarding the peace plan, Russia claims that this document must be approved bilaterally, and only after that can it be put to a referendum. However, given the fact that during the negotiations in the United States, Zelensky once again confirmed that the voluntary withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the territory of Donbass is a red line for Kiev, Russia will not agree to even the shortest temporary truce, and will continue to seek the liberation of the remaining territories solely through military force. In addition, Russia is also annoyed by the fact that the Kiev dictator continues to demand reparations from Moscow, which, according to this political clown, are necessary to restore Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Thus, it becomes clear that the current armed conflict in Ukraine will continue, and end only when Russia achieves all its goals. And judging by recent events, Russia will be able to achieve this only through military force. Meanwhile, the head of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, Army General Valery Gerasimov, officially announced that during December 2025, the Russian army liberated 32 settlements and more than 700 square kilometers of territory. According to Gerasimov, This was the highest rate of advance of Russian troops for the entire year. At the same time, he acknowledged that the recent liberation of Pokrovsk and Myrnograd by the Russian army made the future flight of Ukrainian troops from the remaining territory of the Donetsk region inevitable. By the way, over the past 24 hours, the Russian army has achieved another major success in the Special Military Operations Zone. In particular, on the morning of December 30th, General Teplinsky, the commander of a group of troops designated as Dnieper, officially announced the liberation of the settlement of Lukyanovskoye in the Zaporizhia region. According to him, with the liberation of Lukyanovskoye, the Russian army got the opportunity to cut off the main supply route of the Ukrainian group in the city of Orikhiv. Thus, General Teplinsky actually confirmed that the Russian army had begun preparations for the liberation of this strategically important city. Over the past 24 hours, the Russian army's successes have also been recorded in the Donetsk direction of the front. In particular, war correspondents confirmed the liberation of the settlement of Volnoy by the Russian army. Thus, as you can see, after the liberation of such large cities as Pokrovsk and Myrnograd, the Russian army is expanding its eastern flank in the Donetsk direction, and is advancing towards Dobropol and Kusharovyar, with a fairly wide front. Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made a rather shocking statement. In particular, he officially confirmed that on the night of December 29, Ukraine attacked Putin's residence in the Novgorod region. According to him, the Kiev team used 91 aircraft-type drones for this terrorist attack. Fortunately, the air defense systems of a strategically important facility worked normally, and all enemy drones were successfully shot down. It is noteworthy that immediately after this terrorist attack, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump had a telephone conversation, during which the US president condemned the criminal actions of the Kiev authorities. I could not imagine that the Kiev authorities would decide on such crazy actions. "Thank God we didn't give them Tomahawk cruise missiles," Donald Trump said. Furthermore, Russian presidential aide Yuri Ushakov said that during this telephone conversation, Vladimir Putin noted that against the backdrop of Ukraine's numerous defeats on the battlefield, the Kiev regime had begun to engage in state terrorism, and that in this regard, Russia's negotiating position would be reviewed. In addition, Putin also warned Trump that in the coming days, Russia will give a tough response to the terrorist actions of the Kiev regime. By the way, on the morning of December 30th, reputable war correspondent Alexander Kotz, citing his sources in the Russian Defense Ministry, said that Moscow was preparing a crushing blow to Ukraine. At the same time, he recalled Putin's words that Russia possesses the latest missiles that are much more powerful than Orshnik. The fact that Russia is preparing harsh punishment for Ukraine for attempting to attack Putin's residence was also confirmed by Deputy Andrei Kolesnik. According to him, the Kremlin has already made a decision on this issue. Furthermore, insiders in the Kremlin have reported that Putin has already approved targets that will have to be destroyed on the territory of Ukraine. At the same time, it is reported that Russia is likely to use a new missile, which the world has never seen before. Against this backdrop, insiders in Kiev confirmed that representatives of diplomatic agencies of foreign states started to leave the capital of Ukraine en masse. Ordinary citizens of Ukraine are also trying to leave Kiev, fearing a retaliatory strike from Russia. Well, my friends, let's hope that Trump will not be able to persuade Putin to reverse his decision to strike at Ukraine. Personally, I believe that Moscow should severely punish Ukraine and its supporters in the European Union and London for any terrorist attacks on Russia. Only in this case, Ukraine and its Western supporters will stop attacking Russian civilian ships, civilian infrastructure, and killing Russian generals. Putin should finally understand that the West perceives his gestures of goodwill as weakness, and that only the language of force can cause fear among all Moscow's enemies and stop terrorist attacks on Russia.
An alleged drone attack on Russian President Vladimir Putin's residence has triggered an explosive chain reaction across Moscow and Washington. Russia claims Ukraine attempted to strike Putin's state residence in the Novgorod region, an accusation Kyiv denies, but one that has now become the flashpoint for threats, warnings, and rising pressure on the peace process.
The stinking Kiev bastard is trying to derail the settlement of the conflict. He wants war. Well, now at least he'll have to stay in hiding for the rest of his worthless life.
That threat came from former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, reacting directly to the alleged attack on Putin's residence. The language is raw, personal, and deliberate. Moscow's message is clear. Targeting the Russian leader's home is being framed not just as an act of war, but as a personal red line. Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, then elevated the accusation from political threat to official state position, laying out Moscow's version of events and formally blaming Kyiv for what he called a terrorist act.
On the night from 28 to 29th of December 2025, the Kyiv regime carried out a terrorist attack using 91 long-range attacking drones against the state residence of the Russian president in the Novgorod region. All drones were destroyed by the air defense systems of the Russian armed forces. No information has been received regarding casualties or damage caused by drone debris.
Lavrov said the alleged strike on Putin's residence came at the worst possible moment during intensive negotiations between Russia and the United States. He warned that retaliatory targets and timing have already been identified, even as Moscow claims it will not walk away from talks. The allegation then reached the White House. US President Donald Trump confirmed he was briefed directly by Putin and reacted with visible anger, signaling that an attack on a leader's home crosses a dangerous threshold.
You know, told me about
They
it.
did just what
President
Putin wanted them to
Putin told me about it. Early in the morning, he said he was attacked. That's no good. It's no
But
good.
Russian officials
Don't
said
forget, you know, the tomahawks. I stopped the tomahawks. I didn't want that.
do. Britain
We're
probably did
talking
it.
about, you know, it's a
Putin don't care.
delicate period of time.
See, Putin don't care who did it. Y'all did it. Y'all taking the residents. No, they never be able to hit Putin. He's better protected than these clowns, but that's not the point. And Putin, that Trump know, they want me dead. They gotta go.
This is not the right time. It's one thing to be offensive because they're offensive. It's another thing to attack
Any world leader, he letting Trump know they're putting your life in danger. They could kill you and say, I did it.
his house. It's not the right time to do any of that. And Can't do it. And I learned about it from President Putin, and I was very angry about it.
Ukraine has dismissed the claim as another Russian lie designed to sabotage peace talks. But the damage is already unfolding, from Medvedev's threat to Lavrov's warning of retaliation to Trump's public anger. Every reaction now centers on one explosive allegation: an attack on Putin's residence that risks tipping diplomacy into a far more dangerous phase.
Y'all gotta remember, Putin done already warned them, I haven't even started war with y'all. And I haven't attacked no government facilities, and I have tried to kill none of their political leaders. But y'all tried to kill me, so he told Trump, now we're going to rethink all of our strategies on how we deal with Ukraine. And we've already picked out the targets. Now he's going to target their leaders and their government facilities. And that's what Trump wants him to do, because he wants Putin to force Zelensky into the peace deal that Trump wants before it get out of hand and they lose everything in Europe.
The first glimpse of the famous Russian Oreshnik, the mobile missile complex, has officially entered combat service in Belarus, an unusual nightmare, silencing all Western voices.
They put this on alert this morning, the Oreshnik. Just as destructive as a nuclear missile, but only Russia has it. There's no defense for it. It'll destroy everything. And he's been warned them. Now they put it on combat duty and said prepare to receive a few of these. It can hit anywhere in Europe. They're not safe. He's already warned them. But you try to kill
the Oreshnik system has entered combat duty in Belarus. The Russian Ministry of Defense reported on December 30th, 2025, showing the first footage of the Russian-made Oreshnik hypersonic ballistic missile. And the unit equipped with the system has been prepared in advance, moving through the forest area, and the crew is wearing camouflage. A solemn ceremony was held in the Republic of Belarus for the deployment of a unit to combat duty. In order to complete the military ritual of changing the duty shift, the flag of the Strategic Missile Forces was raised. All conditions for combat duty and accommodation of Russian military personnel are currently being mastered in a new combat patrol area. Specialists in launch crews, signals, security and power supply, as well as drivers of missile system components are being retrained, using modern training equipment before entering new combat duty in Belarus, near NATO territory. As a reminder, the first satellite imagery captured the Yuzhmash plant in Dnipropetrovsk, Ukraine, where Oreshnik was first deployed in November 2024. Ukraine was warned an hour in advance of the Oreshnik's arrival, which traveled through the upper atmosphere and carried a non-nuclear warhead during the strike. As expected, the Oreshnik's warhead destroyed the interiors of the bunkers, roasting them, depriving Ukraine of a vital missile technology hub for its armed forces. Thus, today the rules have changed forever. Belarus Oreshnik missiles put NATO under punishment. Military analysts stated that Oreshnik has no counterpart on planet, invisible to air defense radars, practically impossible to intercept. It's a mobile system, so it can be moved anywhere. Nobody else has anything like it, explained Viktor Litovkin.
You see what? And that's why Trump nervous, because Russia already said they was going to hand these out. He threatened Joe Biden, but he said they're going to hand these out to Russian friends, the friends of Russia. Since you want to give Ukraine all these weapons, NATO, Putin already wanted, we'll get the friends of Russia. Who is the friends of Russia? He's not just talking about Iran. He's specifically talking about Venezuela. If Venezuela received these missiles anywhere in the U.S., will be a target. That's another reason why Trump did not give Zelensky the Tomahawk missiles, because Russia told him, we will give your enemies these missiles, this type of shit.
If launched, the time it takes an Orishnik with its speed of Mach 10 could reach a European capital from its launch pad. Media reports indicate that it is only 7 minutes and 20 seconds to Brussels, where NATO's largest headquarters is located. Kyiv, 1 minute and 51 seconds. Warsaw, 1 minute and 40 seconds. Berlin, 4 minutes and 10 seconds. Paris, 8 minutes, and to London, 8 minutes and 30 seconds. Belarus confirms the system is now on combat duty, and this deployment strengthens Russian capabilities for targeting across Europe if necessary, amidst persistently high tensions with NATO.
But this is what they want to play. They want to play tough. Okay. They shouldn't play with Putin like this. Well, it's a very dangerous time. It's war everywhere. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are fighting each other in Yemen right now. I got to cover that later on. With so much what's going on in Africa, but it's on purpose. Israel didn't recognize a fake state of Somaliland. That's a fictitious place, but got the world in uproar. It's too much going on, but it's controlled chaos. You got a certain group of people who operate good when chaos is going on this planet, the small hats.
After the Trump and Zelensky meeting in Mar-a-Lago a couple of days ago, allegedly Ukraine launched 91 drones to try and take out the residence of Volodymyr Zelensky, Vladimir Putin. Sorry, couldn't get that out. And his residence in Novgorod. That's the claim anyway. And what could go wrong with that? And of course, if we're trying to get to peace, naturally, that's the best thing you can do. If you're the Ukraine side, at least that's the claim here. Ukraine completely denies that they did that. Russia completely says that they did, and they took down 91 drones in the process.
See, this the point. This the point. It don't matter if Zelensky okayed it or didn't okay it. Russia has already proven to Trump the drones came out of the territory of Ukraine. It's not a Russian false flag. Now, that's all Putin needed to know, that it came out your territory. Who cares if it was the British, the France, the Germans, or the CIA? Your ass still going to pay for it. That's a fact.
And then we're going to take a look at just where are we on this whole issue of trying to get to peace with all of these pieces going on, not the least of which, of course, is always the ground truth reality on the battlefield. And we literally have no one better to assess all of these things today than the ever popular Colonel Douglas Macgregor, defense and foreign policy analyst, former advisor to the Secretary of Defense, and highly decorated combat veteran and big time friend of the show. Doug, welcome back.
Hey, happy to be here.
Well, let's just jump right into this, because this was a weird thing. And I'll just say this whole claim that Ukraine launched these drones, I can see possibilities that this is a disinformation campaign on really both sides. I have no idea what's true on this. I can see where Ukraine would have some incentive to try and do this, to try and maybe draw Russia into some kind of overreaction that could then spawn a bring into the United States. I can see Russia saying it just to say, hey, these guys are crazy and now we're going to do something more. I don't know what's going on, but what is your understanding of what actually happened?
Well, this sort of thing is always a matter for speculation. But I think it's pretty obvious that we are not on the road to the sudden outbreak of peace and tranquility. And I don't know why anybody is suggesting that, but maybe they don't know what else to do and they want everybody to feel good about the new year. You know, most of the perceptions and policies of Washington, D.C., and I'm afraid of the Trump administration, seem to be anchored in a fantasy world that no longer exists. I think things have changed dramatically. The only thing that was accomplished by launching these 91 drones toward Russia is to utterly offend and infuriate the Russian people. not just its government, not just its president, but the entire nation. I don't think people understand that for the Russians, this fight with Ukraine is no longer just a fight with Ukraine. They understand that this is a proxy war. They're really up against European NATO and, frankly, us. Although for some reason the Russians continue to like us, and I think Mr. Putin is trying desperately to believe that President Trump is sincere, and he gives him the benefit of the doubt. But the truth is, not much has changed for the better. In fact, things are getting worse. So I think we have to understand that for Russia, this is an existential war. They're not just fighting Ukraine. They now see themselves unambiguously as engaged in a war with Europe. And that's unfortunate, because you and I know, anybody who's lived in Europe for any length of time knows, the vast majority of Europeans have absolutely no interest in going to war inside Ukraine against Russia. It's absurd. But the globalist governments, particularly in London, Paris, Berlin, and Warsaw, they continue to march down this path to confrontation and conflict. It's kind of interesting that Tusk would suggest that peace is on the verge of breaking out, because he's worked tirelessly to prevent it. I don't know what to say, except that now President Putin has transformed this operation. It's not just, somebody told me this morning, well, they brought in another 135,000 recruits for training and so forth. That's a routine draft operation. But nobody's paid attention that somewhere is between 650 and 750,000 reservists have also been notified. And it's estimated that after these people are mobilized, there probably 300,000 or 400,000 will remain on active duty for the foreseeable future. I think President Putin has been very serious when he says, if the Europeans want a war with us, we'll give it to them. And we are prepared. And I think what he's doing is he's building up the force to the point where they will strike very decisively against Europe if the Europeans are dumb enough to push them on the issue. And again, when I say Europeans, I'm talking about the globalist elites. So the bottom line is, I think President Trump means well and would like to see this end, but his government, the CIA, the Department of Defense, everything continues to do exactly what it's been doing for the last several years, whether or not he's aware of it. And so I see no chance whatsoever for something positive to result from the current talks that were just held in Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah, and I'm gonna get to that in just a second, because we have a number of important things that were said there. I'd like your viewpoints on. But in terms of what may come after this, these allegations, these 91 drones, whether it did or didn't happen, at this point, it nearly doesn't matter. What matters is what is going to come next, and what are the sides going to do about it. Here is what Sergei Lavrov said about those 91 drones.
В ночь с 28 на 29 декабря 2025 года киевский режим предпринял террористическую атаку с использованием 91 ударного беспилотного летательного аппарата дальнего действия на государственную резиденцию президента Российской Федерации в Новгородской области. Подобные безрассудные действия не останутся без ответа. Объекты для ответных ударов и время их нанесения вооруженными силами России определены.
That's a pretty ominous statement here. The actions and timing have already been determined. So apparently we're just waiting for something to happen, not wondering if it's going to, but only to wait for it to be unveiled. What do you make of that?
Well, I talked to about the increase in the size of the ground force and its readiness to conduct offensive operations. I think they're operating already on 6 to 8 different axes. It's only a matter of time until Zaporizhzhia falls completely into Russian hands. Then I think they'll cross the river and seize Odessa. I think that's inevitable. I've always felt that way, and I think that's true for Kharkov. But you have something else now. You have the movement of the Oreshnik missile systems and their launchers to the west inside Belarusia. And I think that's a signal that if the Europeans are dumb enough to launch anything seriously dangerous at Russia, if they provide the Ukrainians with more sophisticated equipment. And of course, we know that we and MI6 are still providing lots of satellite intelligence. Well, then they'll use those Oreshniks, and there's no defense against them. They're hypersonic. We can't shoot them down. The Europeans are going to watch substantial portions of Germany and Poland potentially and other countries vanish in a hail of destruction. I think they're quite serious. I wish people would take them seriously.
And what do you think? I mean, that's potential. That's what happens if the West is stupid enough and we actually initiate something. But what do you think that Lavrov meant right there? Because I thought it was also telling that he said not an act of war, but he said this was a terrorist act by the Ukraine side against the residents here. And then he said something specific is coming. Do you have any suggestion or any idea at all what that might be?
Well, first of all, he's using this word terrorism because at this stage, there is no Ukrainian ground defensive capability at all. The only thing that they can do is for brief periods of time, hang on by the fingernails against the Russians. And I think that time is passing. There's no longer any discussion about Donbass. Withdraw what remains of your force from Donbass. No, they don't care about that. They're going to annihilate those forces. I guess what's coming next will be the kind of offensive operation that I mentioned earlier. And then the other thing is that if I were Zelensky, I would no longer assume that I'm going to be given immunity, because Putin made it very clear at the beginning that he wasn't interested in killing Zelensky or any of his friends, because the Russians always wanted somebody to negotiate with so that they could come to a conclusion with Ukraine. Well, I don't think that's a constraint any longer. I think if I were Zelensky and his comrades, I would be very concerned about my immediate future. I think the gloves are going to come off as far as the government in Kiev is concerned.
Well, you mentioned Zelensky, and you said if I was him, I would be concerned about that. Apparently, he is not that way. He's not thinking in those terms. In the contrary, there was an interview with Brett Baer after he had this meeting with Trump at Mar-a-Lago, where he talked about a number of things. I'm going to do a whole show on really disassembling a lot of the things that he said in that interview, but I want to focus in on a couple that he said, which are really, really critical here. One is that he claims, hey, you know what? After this meeting, we are 90% of the way there to a peace deal.
20 points plan. And when I said 90%, it's true, because there are questions with 2 points. That's why I said 90%. It's really 90%. It's very productive. Even with one question today, we've been very close, and I think we have a problem with one question. It's about territories. Yes, this is a difficult question, but even with the territories, even with the fact that on this one point we have different views with Russians, this is important not with Americans, with Russians. And the United States understand the positions of sides, and they try to find a compromise. We spoke about different steps, and Ukraine demonstrated during these months these steps.
So I'm going to get to the specific issue of the territories in a second, but what it's really stood out to me in that one is he says basically there's 2 points, but really there's just 1 point. It's the territory. He doesn't even mention anything in this 20-point peace plan that he had or that anybody talked about was anything about NATO, anything about a neutrality status, anything about demilitarization, the size of the Ukraine army, or what Russia has said is the denazification requirement. None of those are even mentioned. So how does anyone think that they are 90% of the way there?
Well, I think Alistair Crook has made this point before, and I think he's right. And I think that's what you just heard. We negotiate with ourselves. In other words, we talk to Zelensky, we talk to the Europeans talk to Zelensky, and they talk to us. The problem is that no one ever sits down and goes back to the Russians. Because if you go back to the Russians and you look at what they have explicitly stated since June of 2024, and even before that, if you're going to treat the territorial issue as something that is not up for negotiation or discussion, which is effectively what Zelensky keeps insisting, you're whistling past the graveyard. and the graveyard is Ukraine at this point. So I think it's all nonsense. Anything the man says is just ridiculous. And he's encouraged to say these things because there are people in Washington, as well as in London, Paris, Berlin, and Warsaw, who want to sustain this war. Now, there are very, very real, important, tangible reasons that many people want it to continue because they profit from it personally. Contributions, kickbacks, you name it. But this has nothing to do with our national interest, or for that matter, the national interest of the countries in Europe. So we have a problem right now. The people representing us in the West are largely disconnected from us. And so they're playing this piece of theater in Ukraine to the bitter end.
Yeah, and I, there's the whole idea that there are some who want this to be over. I think this next soundbite I'm going to play here really illustrates why that's not the case. And I want people to watch this video from a different perspective than just what he's actually saying here, because in light of what you just said about what the Russians' well-known position since June of 2024 and even beyond that, about the demilitarization, denazification, no NATO, neutrality status, and rights for the Russian people. They've never wavered from any of those. They're still on them today. Knowing that, then when you say, Zelensky, that we're 90% of the way there, and one of the issues is territory. And then when specifically asked about the territory, he says, what I'm about to show, to me, this signals me being Zelensky, I don't want this war to be an end. How do you see this when he said this?
What we have now, we have the question with the territories. And we can't, it's not about referendum or parliament or the president. We can't just withdraw. It's out of our law. We can't just withdraw from our territories. It's not only the law. People live there. 300,000 people live there. We can't lose just people. We can't go out because 100,000 have been wounded. Dozens of them have been killed there. And so I said that it's not only about the law and also our army there. That's why we proposed, I think, the compromise. If we do free economic zone, that we have to move some kilometers back, it means that Russia has to make mirror steps some kilometers back.
So here's my compromise for you, Doug. From a position of strength, you being on the Russian side in this particular case, I'm going to say, even though you've said that you're going to have all of this territory, it's already part of the Russian Federation, I'm going to offer you a compromise that we'll withdraw from our part here as long as you withdraw from the territory you've already gained. So that means you have a net loss of where the current line of contact is. What could go wrong with that?
Well, what can go right with it is the real question. The man is in a fantasy land. It's exactly what President Trump said a couple of years ago. Or I guess it's not, I guess it is not necessarily a couple of years, but perhaps, 8 months? He said, you hold no cards. I mean, effectively, what he was telling Zelensky in the Oval Office was, shut up. You have nothing to say. That has not changed. In fact, the situation is worse than ever. For some reason, maybe it's donor-induced. I'm not sure. President Trump has maintained the fiction that this man has something to say and has some sort of influence. He has none. So I think if you're a Russian right now, you understand that the only way this war is going to end is that if you end it militarily on the ground. And that's what I think they're going to do. I've always felt that way. I think that's where we're headed. And we better understand that. And I think the Europeans had better stay out of it, because if they think they're going to intervene to stop it, they're going to be crushed. That's it.
Well, it's unclear. You mentioned a minute ago Donald Tusk. He actually said, in light of all these meetings here, that peace is on the horizon. Here's how he put it.
Peace is on the horizon. There's no doubt that things have happened that give hope that this war can end, and quite quickly. But it's still hope, still far from 100% certainty. The key outcome of recent days is the American Declaration. And this is, of course, something new. Some are even surprised. The American Declaration of the United States' readiness to participate in security guarantees for Ukraine after the conclusion of peace, including the presence of American troops, for example, on the border or on the line of contact between Ukraine and Russia. These rather clear declarations have appeared for the first time. We'll see how consistent our partners across the Atlantic will be. But this gives hope for a successful conclusion to these talks.
What in the hell is he talking about, Doug? I have not heard Trump say anything about our security guarantees equal troops on the ground, either on the Russian-Ukraine border or inside of Ukraine, which is what he just said there. Is he projecting what he hopes Trump is doing, or have I missed something?
Well, President Trump has said a number of things that can be easily confused or misinterpreted. He has talked about our willingness to provide guarantees to Ukraine as the part of a settlement. Well, that the predisposition there is that the assumption there is that you're going to get a settlement. If there's no settlement, then the guarantees are meaningless. I don't think we can guarantee anything in the region at all. I think the entire world has changed. Our guarantee to Ukraine would be as meaningful as London's guarantee to the Poles in 1939. Just irrelevant. We're not there. We can't guarantee anything. But there are people in Eastern Europe in particular, and in Poland in particular, who think we can. They want desperately to believe that we can somehow or another make things happen. I think President Trump knows that's not possible. He likes to posture and pretend that he can. We see a lot of that on a routine basis, but I don't see it. So Tusk is a strange duck. I think he's living in a fantasy world. His perceptions are rooted in the past, not in the present. And there is no future for these so-called guarantees. The only
Doug, I want to ask you something on this guarantee, because this is something that perplexes me. People can want a lot of things, and they can have a lot of preferences on outcomes, and they can be detached from reality or not. But when it comes down to actions, you still, I think, you can correct me, maybe I am wrong, that when it comes down to actions, you know that there still are limits of power. There still are realities that have to be dealt with. And when they keep talking all this stuff, all these European leaders, Tusk, Starmer, Merz, ad infinitum, that they want security guarantees for a negotiation at the end. That implies that they think that somebody, and they keep talking about teeth, they keep talking about something that's different than the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, et cetera. They want something that's going to be resulting in somebody fighting Russia if these terms are broken. But if nobody has been willing for 4 years to fight for Ukraine now, what do they base this presumption that at some future date they would literally fight for a corrupt Ukraine regime against Russia?
Well, I see I see no future for it at all in Europe, because I don't see any evidence that the Europeans are going to flock to the recruiting stations and sign up for a war in Ukraine against Russia. I think that's pure nonsense. On the other hand, I think President Trump frequently says things without understanding fully the consequences of the remark. And he has talked about guarantees. You can look at the situation in Gaza right now. President Trump has put his name at the center of the resolution of the Gaza conflict, the so-called peace board, where he is going to be the chairman and so forth. This is crazy. He can't control the Israelis, and the Israelis have made it abundantly clear that they have every intention of annihilating what human life remains in Gaza. They're going to kill them all. So I don't know why he does this, but he does. But perhaps, again, President Trump is a marketing genius. He's a salesman, and he promises things that he can't deliver. Now, I don't know what he said privately. My suspicion is that he was much harder on Zelensky privately than we realize in public. At least I hope so, because I think he's made it clear on more than one occasion that as far as he's concerned, the war is lost by Ukraine. Ukraine cannot win the war. It's over. And you've got to sit down and negotiate seriously. But the Europeans aren't going to support that. And he apparently, even though he's in theory the leader of NATO, he doesn't seem to have the influence to compel the Europeans to get in line. So I guess my point is the use of the word guarantee, I think, is being a little superficial. And people tend to interpret it in whatever way they like. And the Poles in particular are very anxious to make themselves dependent on guarantees from the United States. I mean, that's the whole point of them joining NATO, That's one of the reasons a lot of people at the time, back when I was at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, all expressed admiration and delight that the Poles were going to be in NATO. But with the same breath, we all said, but given their history of unrelenting hostility to Russia, are we letting ourselves in for trouble? Because is Poland satisfied? Is it satiated? Is it a status quo state? Or does it have aspirations to control parts of Ukraine and White Russia? And people say, well, no, they don't. That's not really true. You got to go through all these states that are on the border with Russia right now, or with Ukraine, look at their histories and look at their interests. And their interests are not status quo oriented. So I think Tusk is making a statement from a vantage point of a man in Warsaw who has aspirations much beyond the war, the current proxy war in Ukraine. And so he's very anxious to tie whatever happens in Ukraine to some sort of guarantee. And again, we don't know what was said privately. We just don't. We have heard this word guarantee kicked around in public, but I don't think it's ever defined. And that's a danger. We do this a lot in the United States. We don't carefully define the terms and make it clear what we really mean or don't mean. I think if you strap President Trump in a chair and said, "What do you mean?" he would say, "We will not go to war with Russia. Period. It's not going to happen." But then in the same breath, he'll say, "But we'll offer guarantees if it helps bring about peace." Do you understand?
No. Neither does anyone else. Let's look at that at what, and I'm going to say Europe, but we're going to zero in on Tusk and in Poland, since he's the one that brought this topic up in today. And that when they talk about security guarantees and they talk about robust and teeth and all that for Russia, do you think that they're looking to say, hey, look, and in this case Poland, I will use military force against Russia as long as you do Germany, as long as you do France, as long as you do UK, we're all together, and as long as we got the U.S. Air Force over our shoulders and the tanks on the ground, then we'll all do that. But the question is, what if any one of those aren't there? Do you see any prospect that Poland would say in a future agreement that, yes, Russia has violated the agreement, so we'll actually march troops against Russian forces? What do you think?
Not right now. I see it. I think it's impossible. And I think Tusk knows that. I think the new Nawrocki, the new president.
Yeah.
He's made it very clear there will be no Polish troops on the ground in Ukraine. I think he's much more realistic. But I think he's moving carefully because he's still dealing with what I would call the extreme Polish nationalists who view the United States and NATO as leverage they can employ to aggrandize Poland. And I think that's something, we need to understand. The Poles, nobody knows history in the United States. Nobody cares about history. Remember what Henry Ford said? All history is bunk, okay? Most Americans don't remember what happened in Vietnam. They don't remember what happened in Desert Storm. That's ancient history. And I think we don't understand that in Poland, what we would consider to be ancient history is very much alive. And if you go back to the late 1600s and the middle of the 1700s, there are vast tracts of territory that are now part of Belarusia and part of Ukraine and Lithuania that were all part of this so-called Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And it was a very powerful state at its height, and it lasted for several centuries. The people living in Poland know it, the people living in Lithuania know it, and so do the Russians and the Ukrainians. The funny thing is that the Ukrainians recently have made comments along the lines of the Poles currently control 2 or 3 cities that are really historically Ukrainian, and we want them back. Think about that. You have Ukrainians telling the Poles, you're controlling cities that historically are Polish, and we want them back. This is Eastern Europe. This is a place we don't want to be. These are people with whom we don't want to work. I have to be blunt. We have no interest in these things. We don't want to be drawn into any conflict with Russia over any of it. It's not important to us. It never was. and it never should be. I think that privately, President Trump understands that. But he's in the habit of talking a little too loosely on occasion about what we what we can or cannot do. And in most cases, remember, President Trump, Mr. Make America Great Again, isn't about to admit that there are limits to our power and resources. He doesn't do that. Every time you hear him, he says, well, we just had a terrific meeting. Everyone was amazing. And we are really close to a solution. And then he walks away. And of course, it's hot air. It's not real because the Russians aren't part of it.
Right. And you know what? I think, Doug, that you mentioned that Poland is trying to leverage NATO and the United States to the aggrandizement of Poland itself. But I think that's something that we see all over Europe right now, and that's with Macron and with Merz and certainly with Keir Starmer. I think they have learned from watching cabinet meetings, quite frankly, on TV in the United States, how you get Trump to try and on your side. And I think that they're all trying to leverage him. And I think all of that circles back to something you said at the top of the show here, is that we're not leading NATO. We're not telling people what they're going to do, which American presidents in the past have done and gotten people into line when it was necessary. Right now, I don't see any evidence that Trump is getting anybody into any kind of lines because, and this is something you've said on previous shows, I don't think he has a strategic vision for understanding what needs to happen, much less how to make it happen.
Well, that may be true, but the thing that also worries me today, much as it did when he was in the first term, is that I don't think he really controls things. I think the Central Intelligence Agency has its own agenda. They're effectively a rogue organization for all intents and purposes. The CIA does what it pretty much wants. It has its own agenda. I think that the Department of Defense is another loosely controlled organization. I don't think he has a grip on everything. I can't even begin to imagine what else is happening in the State Department or in many of the other important agencies. I just don't. I've never seen a coherent strategic framework that could be followed and understood. And, we have this thing, and I think it was Don Jr. who recently said, the best thing about my dad is that he's unpredictable. Actually, Don, no, that's a bad thing. Because in the world that we live in, which is truly multipolar, where there are numerous states that have military, economic power and financial interests at least as strong as our own, and they do now. We have states that perhaps 100 years ago might have been irrelevant because they lacked the size of the population, but today they have access to technology and the ability to organize themselves and cooperate with others in ways that wasn't true in the past. It could be very harmful to us. So I think what you need is something far more predictable. You need a coherent strategic framework that clearly states what you will and will not do, when and under what circumstances you will fight. And we also need to get out of this business of declaring someone a permanent enemy and treating that state as an enemy when it's not. Instead of looking at everything from the standpoint of limited liability partnerships, where on some occasions we cooperate and others we can't. But it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to be in a state of hostility with a state that refuses in one area not to cooperate with you, but in another does. All of this sort of infantile, a friend of mine characterized it very well to me recently. He called it the mean girls approach to U.S. foreign policy, where we're going to get you. And then everybody cheers on the side, you're bad. And it's just crap. It's absurd. It makes no sense. I think we're guilty of that. And the American people are mesmerized by a lot of that. I get emails from friends all the time. Well, I'm glad the president's being tough on those Russians. They got to be brought back under control. What are you talking about? They think this is the Cold War or something. It's beyond belief, but these things persist. The biggest problem today in Washington is people's perceptions and policies are not anchored in a reality that would help us understand the present and the future. They're all anchored in the past.
Well, and in fact, you talk about this almost Jekyll and Hyde kind of situation, if I can characterize it that way, on Trump, is that he seems to understand things in one hand, then on the other hand doesn't. Those were both on display here yesterday or before yesterday at this. Here's how he characterized all these meetings.
We had a terrific meeting. We discussed a lot of things. As you know, I had an excellent phone call with President Putin that lasted for over 2 hours. We discussed a lot of points, and I do think we're getting a lot closer, maybe very close. The president and I just spoke to the European leaders. We thought it was appropriate to speak with them. And our meeting was excellent. We covered, somebody would say 95%. I don't know what percent, but we have made a lot of progress on ending that war, which is really certainly the most deadly war since World War II, probably the biggest war since World War II.
So a lot of excellent points were discussed, and it was an excellent meeting. You said, you literally mentioned that a minute ago, and then there it was right there on display. But I don't, where's it going and where is it coming? Just a lot of progress, maybe 95%. He's not going to limit anything. I mean, what should we come out of this meeting believing that we are or are not closer to an outcome based on what he said?
President Trump is a brilliant salesman. I think there's nobody better. He's someone who could sell snow to Eskimos. He could say there, now this snow that I've got right here next to me, this is the best snow available. And I know you want to build igloos. You've got to buy this snow. This will perform better than any other snow you've ever had. It'll keep you warm, not just this winter, but in perpetuity. And if it melts, you can drink it because it's pure. So you've got to buy this snow. I think that's President Trump. Now, what he didn't say is, well, we spoke to Vladimir Putin on the phone, and Vladimir Putin said the following. Of course not. There is no chance for a settlement at this stage, none whatsoever. We are not nearing the end of the war, at least not in the sense that is presented there. Are we nearing the end of the war? I think there's a good chance that over the next few months, this thing will grind to a halt, but it will grind to a halt because the Russians have crushed everything that's left on the Ukrainian side that can fight, which is, after all, the purpose that they adopted back in 2022 when they finally realized that sending signals and meeting in Istanbul wouldn't make any difference. Then I think they decided they were going to have to eliminate the Ukrainian military and its neo-Nazi formations and so forth, administrative structures and so forth. Remember, one of the points of the 20 points regarding Ukraine that we've been talking about included a provision for 800,000 Ukrainian troops. You know, what makes anyone think that the Russians in their right mind would put up with that? You know, 80,000 well-armed policemen, maybe 800,000 troops organized to fight. Forget it. I mean, it's just not realistic. So I think President Trump is probably trying to figure out, how do I get out of this? How do we get forward and move on to something else? I think he'd love to change the subject. Maybe that'll happen as a consequence of Venezuela, and then he doesn't have to talk about Ukraine anymore.
Yeah, more on that in just a second. But I kind of, to show the Jekyll Hyde kind of this, he said all this positive stuff without any talks about where it was going to go. But then later in that same press conference, he was asked, what happens if you don't get to a negotiated settlement? And what he said here, I think, is pretty close.
President Trump, I know you've sounded an optimistic note here, but what happens in a few weeks if things sputter? What are you prepared to do?
They keep fighting, and they keep dying. No good. But if things don't happen, they keep fighting, and they keep dying. And we don't want that to happen. He doesn't want it to happen. President Putin doesn't want it to happen either.
You know, and one would imagine, I thought it was interesting in the whole sequence of how this day transpired, is that Trump started the day talking to Putin on the phone first, then he met with Zelensky, and then he talked to Putin on a second time after that. And it sounds to me like probably some of the echoes of that conversation with Putin, that he says, hey, we're either going to get this what we want or we're going to keep fighting. And so I think that's maybe what Trump was referring to there. But, you know, he throws his hands up like, you know, what can you do? Shouldn't that inform Trump's decision about what he should do because of what the Russians can do?
again, the intelligent thing for President Trump to do is to go back to where he was in the Oval Office with Zelensky. Point out that Zelensky has no cards. He's lost the war. And it's incumbent upon Zelensky to negotiate an end to the conflict. He should demand that the states that border Ukraine, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, that they all come to a meeting, probably the Germans as well, and help negotiate a settlement, put an end to the conflict, adjust boundaries, because that has to happen. He's not thinking in those terms. He probably figures, well, I can't herd those cats in that direction anyway, so I'm not going to try. Okay, if you're not going to try, then why are you wasting time, money, and resources on Zelensky at this point? Just walk.
A valid question.
And of course, that was my recommendation before he was elected.
Right.
You know, pull the plug, get out completely. It's not of vital strategic interest to us. It doesn't make any difference to us who controls Eastern Ukraine. Probably doesn't make any difference to us who controls Western Ukraine. And this is a purely European matter, and it's really a very regional, local matter involving the states that I just mentioned. But he hasn't done that. And so he's been drawn into this endless drama that leads nowhere. And so when he was asked what happens if once again nothing happens, he goes, well, that's it. I guess they just die. And of course, he continues to repeat this nonsense. Heavy Russian losses. No, Russian losses are not heavy, have not been heavy. The numbers on the Ukrainian side are skyrocketing. It's outrageous how the human losses there. And that continues. And the infrastructure is destroyed. That is going to continue until the Russians are confident that whatever emerges west of the Dnieper River and in what is historically Ukraine is not going to be hostile to Russia. And if they have to go all the way to the Polish border, even though people say, oh, no, that'll never happen, they're wrong. It can happen, and it will happen if there is no alternative. And I think Europeans need to wake up to that. But that's President Trump's job. He's got to tell them, look, we're out. We've had it. This is a waste of time, money, and resources. We've changed nothing. It's not going to be altered. The status quo has changed. You need to come to terms with this. We will host a conference. And that's what he should do. We'll host a conference. You can go anywhere you want to do that. But we're not going to be party to this tragedy any longer.
And it's interesting, Doug. Gary put up a headline just a second ago that Zelensky is now saying, that's as of today, that we'll go and meet in any format with Putin in order to try to bring this to an end. That's on the heels of all the things that he just said there. And one of the things that he said, and we just showed that clip, was that they quote, cannot give up the Donbass. Ergo, one of the primary objectives of the Russian Federation, that they have to have all the territory, the administrative territory of those 4 oblasts. He's saying, yeah, you're not going to get that, but I'm ready to go talk to you. Well, you said a second ago that what Trump could have done is said, well, I had this conversation with Putin, and here's what he said, but he didn't do that. Well, because Putin knew that, the day before this, he put out his own message so people, if they're willing to listen, can hear exactly where he is. And in this little clip we're going to have here, and you'll have to read on his translation on the screen, he answers the issue about what happens if he doesn't get the territorial ambitions and if he doesn't get the negotiated settlement. Watch this.
Но сегодня, судя по вашим докладам, судя по...
Revolutionary salute to our Queen Yaya's kids for the donation to the war chest. Revolution is a way of life. Absolutely appreciate the love, Queen. Salute.
темпом, который мы наблюдаем на линии боевого соприкосновения, наша заинтересованность в выводе украинских воинских формирований из занимаемых ими пока территорий фактически сводится к нулю по разным совершенно соображениям. И если киевские власти не желают закончить дело миром, мы решим все стоящие перед нами задачи в ходе специальной военной операции вооруженным путем.
So in the most direct way, he said, I at this point, I don't even care what you're willing to withdraw from or not, echoing what you said a second ago. And if you won't resolve this peacefully, meaning accommodate our terms, and I think we can just call it what it is, surrender to our terms, then we're going to take it by force. And he said that in uniform in front of his military generals.
Yes,
Is he
surrender. He
serious?
lost.
And can he do it if he is called out?
He is deadly serious, and he absolutely has the capability to do that. And what is wrong with us in the West? If you go back to January of 2022, the Russians presented a series of proposals for discussion aimed at developing a new security architecture for Europe that would include them and us and the Europeans. It was very much something we should have looked at. It was an excellent proposal, and there was room in that proposal for negotiation. There was room for modifications and alterations. What did we do with it, Dan? We ignored it. We threw it in the corner and said nope. And we were celebrating Russia's entry in Ukraine because there was this feeling in the intelligence agencies that Russia was weak, that Russia would not prevail, and that we could destroy Russia in the process. We could divide it up and rape it of its resources. It all failed. Russia bounced back remarkably quickly. It built up a tremendous military force. Today, if you listen to the testimony of people in the Joint Chiefs, they're talking about a Russia which is a military monster all of a sudden. Well, if it is, it's something we created. It wasn't there in January of 2022. So I think it's important that we take President Putin very seriously. Remember, President Putin has not spread his armed forces all over the world. They are not tied down on multiple fronts against all sorts of enemies or opponents. They don't have naval and ground forces in Central America or Venezuela. They don't have naval forces or ground forces in great numbers in Southeast Asia or in the Northeast Asia. We're the ones that have forces spread out all over the place. And this is not a good thing. We don't have what we need to be able to concentrate and be effective. No one is telling President Trump that, but he needs to know that. He needs to hear it. And he should be interested in withdrawing forces from a number of places quickly so that we can consolidate, we can reorganize, we can rest the force and prepare for new missions in the future, particularly here in the United States and along the border with Mexico. But he's not doing that. And that's unfortunate because he's listening to people who are telling him, well, the Russians really aren't that good. No, they're really not that strong. And that's a mistake. He needs to stop listening.
And he's also being told concurrently that, because he says it out loud, and I'm sure he's being told this, we are the most amazing, powerful military in the force on the planet in the history of the world. No one else is even close, etc. I think that he thinks we can do all these things. And in fact, I actually want to shift gears here in the remainder of the time before we let you go and talk about a couple of those other places that are really important and where we do have our forces diverted. And if things go badly, we could get sucked into other areas too. I want to look first of all at Venezuela, because now Trump mentioned, just admitted kind of in passing, that we have taken out a quote big facility in Venezuela on a dock where some of these alleged drug boats have been coming from, et cetera. And now then, we also were claiming we're going to continue to go after ships. They basically have an oil embargo against Venezuela, which has second and third order effects, which could happen. Venezuela has claimed that they may have military escorts on some of these, so they could set up the potential for a clash. Where is this situation and where do you see it going?
Well, President Trump has effectively tried to blockade from the sea Venezuela and its economic interests. In other words, it's an embargo, if you will. It's not working very well. I don't see any evidence that President Trump is going to directly challenge Russian or Chinese naval assets who may end up escorting ships into and out of Venezuela, ships carrying goods from or to Russia, goods being carried from or to China. In the meantime, he's stealing oil from Venezuela. And he's justifying that on the specious grounds that this oil was somehow or another originally ours. I haven't figured that one out, but that's something that he says. So where does this go? That's up to President Trump. I don't think he wants a major conflagration or war in the Caribbean basin. I think what he wants is what he's talked about. He wants Maduro to go along with his government on the assumption that they can install Machado, who will be able to govern. People I know that have lived for years down there tell me there's no guarantee that if she were installed that she could govern. And you might end up in something that I think others have mentioned, a form of civil war.
Yes, I've heard the same.
If you accept the proposition that at least 70, maybe as high as 80%, but certainly 70% of the population strongly supports Maduro, not because they just love him to death, but because they're in a situation which is tough, but they're eating. They weren't eating when Hugo Chavez took over. I mean, they were in a state of total poverty. Hugo Chavez improved it somewhat. We're trying to argue that everything bad in Venezuela began with Chavez. That's just not true. Venezuela has been a basket case for quite some time. Now, that has to do with the nature of the society down there, their history, culture. There are a lot of things at play here. But the point is, assuming that you can put in Machado, she can hold it together and run it, I think is a big assumption that is yet it will prove to be invalid, frankly.
And Doug, let me ask you, because it seems to me a dynamic could play out there that has played out in many other places when you get rid of one leader, whether it's Saddam Hussein or what's the guess the guy when Obama got rid of when he went into Libya, Gaddafi. Is that the whole security infrastructure existed around those strongmen. And when you take the strongmen out, it's not like that all that infrastructure goes out with it and you try to install somebody else and you're going to end up like Libya where they have competing governments, or like in Iraq where you had, then when we install somebody in there, it turns into a civil war with the insurgency that we were on the ground. Do you see any prospect that wouldn't happen in Venezuela?
No, I think you have to accept the possibility that anything could happen. The breakdown in order could be very severe and precipitate civil unrest on a scale that we can't handle. Now, that goes back to the issue of, are you actually going to go in on the ground? Somebody said Venezuela was Spanish for Vietnam. I suppose there's some truth to that.
No, that's probably not far off.
But one of the things that I like to point out to people is look at Venezuela. 29.5 million or even 30 million. We know the place is enormous in geographic terms, size of France, Germany, Austria together. The terrain is almost identical in many areas to the dense jungle terrain in Vietnam. And of course, you have mountains that are enormous. So this is a place that doesn't lend itself easily to development or control anyway. And what are you going to do? Do you sit out there at sea and ultimately launch missiles and bombs? The place can probably absorb a lot of punishment. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to bow down to you and accept your demands, particularly if your demand is to get rid of the government. What would we do with China? I hear people talking about war with China all the time over in the Defense Department, especially the Navy and the Air Force and the Marines. They all seem to be very anxious to fight China. To do what? China is this fortress continental power that you're not going to influence at all. What makes you think your military power is going to make a dent? You can sink anything coming out of the ports of China on the coast, and you can sink anything trying to go in. But, that's a continental power. You're not going to destroy the country and the civilization. Far from it. They're going to prevail. You're going to end up sailing away looking ridiculous. I think the same thing is true in Venezuela right now. I don't see much prospect for a clear-cut military victory. How do you isolate the place? How do you control it? Forget it. It doesn't lend itself to this sort of thing. And we're, as we've discussed before, we're primarily a maritime and, aerospace power. We're not really a major land power. Now, we are in North America, and I suppose if you really wanted to, you could mobilize the National Guard, call for a draft, so everybody can march merrily into Venezuela. I don't think that would work very well, and I don't see much evidence that anybody's anxious to do it. So the whole idea is dumb. I hate to be blunt, but I don't see any easy exit for the president unless he wants to do what he does very, very well. You heard that down at Mar-a-Lago. I think we're 90% there. He may stand up and say, we're 90% there in Venezuela, and that's enough. And we're going home, and sell that to the American people. Most Americans will probably say, oh, that's great. And a lot of Americans won't pay any attention. But if he goes in there and he starts losing troops, everything changes.
You pay a lot of attention. Gary, do you have that handy? Nope, not going to have it. All right, we're just going to move past that. I want to shift over to another part of the world where there's also at least some ongoing things. So not a whole lot has changed in the China-Taiwan issue, except that at the current time, there is another big military exercise going on there. And one of the things that has happened that it is a little bit different of late is that there was relatively recently was a new president installed in Taiwan that is much more bellicose on talking about things about independence and about their distance from China. And of course, that's always been China's red line, is any declaration of independence that would lead to a military operation. Well, right now, they are engaged in at least a third really large scale, you can call it exercise, you can call it rehearsal, all kinds of things about blockading the island. And in terms of what they can do, this is what one of the Chinese official spokesmen said about this exercise.
The most prominent highlight of this exercise is that the fighting began from the very start. In other words, we launched a coordinated attack from the beginning, forming a powerful offensive posture. Our naval and air forces immediately entered the battle and established their positions. This prominently conveyed three signals. First, it demonstrated the powerful capability of our military to fight in all domains and with full combat effectiveness. In simple terms, we can fight whenever we want and however we want. We are ready to fight, capable of winning, and will surely win. The second prominent signal is that it demonstrated the powerful capability of our military to switch between different combat modes at any time. In recent years, our military training has focused more on how to fight and how to train accordingly. We particularly emphasize integrating training, preparation for war, and actual combat. Therefore, we can switch between different combat modes at any time.
So they're claiming that they can switch from training to combat really quick. And as you can see on the screen there, this is the diagram of what they were doing inside the ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone that Taiwan self-identifies. So they claim it's basically within their airspace. And you see Taiwan is surrounded with all of these military assets, and they keep growing these military assets, air defense, missile defense, missile offense, and naval assets continue to grow. Are you concerned that this is anything new, or it's just the same thing they've been doing since 1949 and we don't need to worry about it?
I think the message is as follows. We have lost the proxy war against Russia in eastern Ukraine, primarily because we decided to challenge Russia on Russia's doorstep. Strategically, victory over Russia in eastern Ukraine was frankly always impossible, because Russia could mobilize all of its assets. It had the advantage of relatively short logistical, chains of supply. It was near the homeland, which enabled much better command control than would have otherwise existed. And they had the ability to go to the strategic defense until they had a large offensive force and then launch it. It's back to the old adage that the further you move against your enemy in foreign territory, the longer your supply lines and the more difficult it becomes to sustain yourself. And that wears out forces. The German army, by the time they reached the outskirts of Moscow, was effectively worn out. They'd lost thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of troops, not to the enemy per se, but to the terrain, to the distance that had to be traveled, to the exhaustion, to the weather, all of these things combined. Now let's switch from Ukraine to Taiwan. What the Chinese are telling us is that if you plan to try and transform Taiwan into the new Ukraine for Northeast Asia, we will crush you. And they're right. We have all the problems in Taiwan, probably worse than we would confront in Europe. And as the Japanese, who had a prime minister that opened her mouth and said something stupid about Japan's interest in Taiwan, who's now being told to shut up and sit in the corner and behave by the imperial bureaucracy that reports to the permanent government of Japan, the Japanese are not going to join us in a war against China. The Koreans will not join us in a war against China. The Vietnamese will not join us in a war against China. Forget it. It's not going to happen. So just what are you going to do about Taiwan? Now, what's the red line for China in Taiwan? Well, there are principally two, maybe three. Number one, the president is talking a great game about independence, but his party does not control the majority in parliament. And the parliament is absolutely opposed to independence. The majority in parliament wants good relations with China. In fact, they are not opposed to reunification with China. Why would they be? Most of their money from their banks on Taiwan resides on the other side, inside China. They're doing a land office business. They're very successful. So this independence thing is not what it seems to be. But if this president were dumb enough and managed to pull it off and say, we are now independent, that's a red line. China would go to war. Now, why? Because China will not allow any foreigners of any kind with any military capability to establish themselves on Taiwan. So what's the other red line? If we put missiles on Taiwan, as we have on the main island of Luzon in northern Philippines, a lot of Americans don't know this, but we have theater ballistic missiles stationed there that can reach Chinese territory. We put them there supposedly as a deterrent. We're arguing that the Chinese want to invade the Philippines. I don't think so. But that's the common wisdom, if you want to call it that, inside the Pentagon. So we have this batteries of theater ballistic missiles aimed at China. Well, the Chinese don't like it. They're offended by it. They don't see the reason for it. They think we're crazy, and I happen to agree with them on that point. But, we're there supposedly the champion of the Philippines. Well, we'll see how long that lasts. The Filipinos were happy to get rid of us previously. They may be happy to do so again in the near future. My point is that Taiwan, though, is a different animal. That's only 100 miles from the Chinese coastline. Taiwan is the location from which all the major Japanese invasion operations were launched in southern China. And it was an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the Imperial Japanese Air Force. So the point is, they're not going to let Taiwan be turned into another, missile arsenal aimed at China. So those are the red lines. Now, we haven't done on Taiwan what we've done in the Philippines. We'd better not, because if we do, we'll have a war. And the Chinese will attack Taiwan, and they will take it. It will not be easy. It will be bloody, but they will do so. But I don't think that's going to happen, because I don't see any evidence that the people governing Taiwan, certainly the parliament or the business interests in Taiwan, want to be dragged into a war with the Chinese mainland. I just don't see it. None whatsoever.
Yeah, for sure they definitely don't. I think my worry is that they end up being sacrificial pawns in somebody else's bigger game. But what do you say to those in the West, especially the United States, that argue, well, if Taiwan gets sucked into a war, if China uses force, you can't just abandon them, because then that's going to, all these dominoes are going to fall, and it's just this terrible thing, and you would be literally sacrificing Taiwan and just handing it over to communist China. What do you say to that?
Well, the lesson of history is that the best thing you can do to your adversary is to encourage him to overextend himself. In other words, if the Chinese are dumb enough, without justification or provocation, to attack, invade, and occupy Taiwan, first of all, they're going to hurt, harm, devastate their business interests all over Asia. Everyone in Asia will be horrified. if the Chinese simply announced, well, we're invading, we're going in tomorrow morning, Taiwan is going to become part of China. Everyone in Asia will be horrified, and everyone on Asia will be standing on our doorstep asking us for help. In other words, let your enemy make mistakes. Don't preclude them from doing so. So my answer to that is it's a military loser trying to defend that island mass against the Chinese, given the forces they have and the capabilities at their disposal. Don't sign up for a losing battle. Don't repeat the mistake of Ukraine. Don't sign up to fight your enemy on his strategic doorstep. You're going to lose. But if the Chinese are dumb enough to do that and then end up potentially in other conflicts in Asia, they will overextend themselves. The Japanese overextended themselves. They went too far in too many places. The Germans overextended themselves unnecessarily. So my point is, it may not seem heroic, but rushing into a hail of bullets is a dumb idea. And that's
And let me ask you, Doug, in the category of don't overextend yourself, and China would be dumb if they did that and got into those local, regional kind of conflicts, absent us. Explain what your view is of how foolish, and at least I think it would be, for us to even contemplate getting locked in with with China over Taiwan, in light of all that we're already committed to giving to Israel in the Middle East, to Taiwan, I keep messing that up, to Ukraine in the Russia war, and all the stuff that we've given out, the arsenals we've already depleted, and the lack of our industrial capacity to sustain anything over time. What would happen if we did get foolish enough and did go into conflict with China? It appears to me that they have already thought this through and do have the industrial capacity to maintain and sustain for a long period of time a high level of exchanges with missiles and every other thing, and that we don't have anywhere near that much. What would happen if that clash happened?
Well, we're going to lose. That's clear. That's not even up for debate. Even the earliest simulations that I saw 20 years ago predicted failure on that account. So I don't think we should be surprised. We've got to get out of this business of looking for wars to fight. We should look for opportunities to avoid conflict, and we're not doing it. And we still have a mess in the Middle East. And it appears that we're going to be dragged back into the Middle East sooner rather than later, because Mr. Netanyahu is determined to finish off Iran. The problem for Mr. Netanyahu is that his situation has worsened. He may think he's improved his missile arsenal and his supply chain, and that we can come in and help protect him. But you've got another problem, and that's Turkey. Right now, you have Israel that wants to establish Jewish supremacy over the region. And you've got Mr. Erdogan, who is interested in a revival of the Ottoman Empire. Both Israel and Turkey are going to collide with each other. It's a question of when, not if. And it's most probably going to happen in Syria because the Israelis, along with us, unfortunately, and MI6, are heavily engaged with the Kurds, who are still determined to create an independent state. And that's not going to be tolerated by the Turks under any circumstances. So the Turks are prepared to go into Syria. They just sent a large convoy into the place within the last 48 hours. Now, why am I bringing this up? You have to practice economy of enemies. I don't care how rich or powerful you think you are. You have to be careful not to unnecessarily provoke others to attack you or attack your friends. We haven't done that. There's no sense of economy. There's no sense of limitations. One of the reasons that President Putin has commanded this campaign to rid himself of the neo-Nazis in Kiev the way he has, he's always been sensitive to the limitations on his power. He said, well, how much have we got? How much can we reproduce? Now, you just mentioned China and Taiwan. China is in a position that we were in 1945, 46, 47, 48, really all the way up to the 60s until 1970. They have the largest manufacturing base in the world. That's what we had, largely as a result of the Second World War. We no longer have that. They've got it.
Yeah.
We can't outproduce them. And the problem that I've always worried about is when it becomes clear that we cannot possibly win in that setting, that we fall back on the nuclear weapon. And that's Armageddon. That's the end of civilization on this planet as we know it. We have to stop thinking in those terms. We've got to start thinking in terms of it's not in our interest to destroy China. It isn't. We want to do business with them. They want to do business with us. It's not in our interest to destroy Russia. They want to do business with us. And we ultimately have a lot of people that want to do business with Russia. Ukraine is this pustule that is diseased and has invaded our body. We got to get rid of it. Ukraine is a liability, not an asset. And the people that want to push this on the Hill are looking at their bank accounts and how much they profited from over the last several years.
Yeah.
And they're not thinking about what is in the interest of the American people. And I think this is very important because we've got to keep in mind that we've squandered enormous wealth on these proxy wars and military interventions. None of these are going to solve the vast numbers of serious social and economic problems in America. You know, progress in a range of areas from living standards, educational performance to high-tech manufacturing has slowed in the United States. It's not accelerating, it's decelerating. And expectations of faster productivity growth through artificial intelligence are flagging. Outsourcing human judgment is turning out to be both ill-advised and dangerous. So what are we doing? What are we doing to break up the overgrown corporations, stopping mergers aimed at shaping narratives in the media industry and suppressing free speech? What are we doing about those things? We're not doing anything. You know, the Wall Street banks long ago turned trust into a sucker's bet. But the information industries and the surveillance technology they develop must not be allowed to restrict our citizens' freedom of thought and behavior. And
Couldn't agree with you more.
where we're headed. Those things are existential for American society, not Ukraine, not Taiwan, and not Venezuela.
Incredibly well said. I couldn't have put that better. That it's important to focus on the real dangers to our society, and it definitely isn't those other foreign ones. Really appreciate you putting it in such stark terms today, Doug. So we really see and cut through the BS of what's really at stake and where the real battles should lie and where the ones should not, and the enemies we should not take on. Really appreciate it. It's been one of the best episodes I've seen that we've.
Military drill around Taiwan Island following the announcement of the island's biggest ever weapons of war deal with the United States, totaling some US $11 billion and including rocket launchers, missiles, armed drones, and more. For many, the Trump regime's weapons deal with Taiwan is concerning, especially in light of similar DC dealings with Ukraine, which has ultimately left hundreds of thousands dead. Beijing, not willing to allow Taiwan to become the next Ukraine, has begun military drills encircling Taiwan Island as a deterrent to separatists and foreign meddlers, simulating the complete blockade of the island. So what's it all about, and how is Western media reacting? Well, just like you might expect, shockingly. Today we'll go beyond the propaganda and check out all of the details. This is Reports on China. I'm Andy Borham here in Shanghai. Let's get reporting. On December 29, Beijing announced it had begun military drills around Taiwan Island under the code name Justice Mission 2025, following the announcement of a US $11 billion weapons deal between Taipei and Washington, D.C. Beijing stopped short of naming the US or the weapons deal specifically in their official announcements, instead stating, "The activities will focus on Sea-Air Combat Readiness Patrol, Joint Seizure of Comprehensive Superiority, blockade on key ports and areas, as well as all-dimensional deterrence outside the island chain. It is a stern warning against Taiwan independent separatist forces and external interference forces, and a legitimate and necessary action to safeguard China's sovereignty and national unity. Foreign Affairs spokesperson Lin Jian was a bit more explicit about the weapons deal, but again didn't name it specifically. He said, "Any sinister schemes to obstruct China's reunification are doomed to fail. External forces attempting to use Taiwan to contain China and arm Taiwan will only embolden the Taiwan independence forces and push the Taiwan Strait towards a dangerous situation of military confrontation and war." The current military drill is simulating the encirclement of Taiwan Island, which would ultimately block off foreign forces and stem the flow of necessary supplies to the island. Now, in my opinion, a complete blockade of Taiwan will lead to the island running out of important supplies within days, leading to the reunification of the region without a single shot needing to be fired. And that is the capability Beijing is showing off during this live fire exercise. Its ability to blockade the island at extremely short notice. So how is Western media reacting? Well, as you can probably imagine, with complete disregard to the facts. CNN, in an article titled "China Stages War Games Around Taiwan After Hitting Out at Major US Arms Deal," made a reckless and misleading statement about the situation. They wrote, "China's ruling Communist Party claims the self-governing democracy of Taiwan as its own territory, despite never having controlled it, and has vowed to take control of the island by force if necessary." Now, there's a lot to unpack in that statement. Firstly, do you notice how they call Taiwan Island the self-governing democracy of Taiwan? Now, why is that statement problematic? Well, because it paints the island as just some cute little democratic island that just wants to be left alone to run a cute little island nation called Taiwan. But that is not true at all, as I've talked about on this show many times. Now, the island of Taiwan is only referred to as Taiwan in Western media in order to mislead readers in the West to believe that claim. In fact, the government on the island, based in Taipei, officially represents the Republic of China, as opposed to Beijing's government, which represents the People's Republic of China. So why are they both calling themselves China? Well, that's because they both claim to be the only legitimate China and to govern all of China, including the Chinese mainland, Hong Kong, and Taiwan Island. And yes, that includes the so-called government on Taiwan Island. They do not just want to be left alone on their little island to live in democratic happiness. They want to take over all of China, and that is according to their very own constitution. Next up is CNN's most damning comment that the Communist Party of China has never controlled Taiwan. Now, what they're doing there is very sneaky, since the CPC doesn't have to have controlled Taiwan Island directly for its claim over the island to be legitimate. Now, why is that? Well, because China is internationally recognized as the only China, meaning its territory includes the Chinese mainland, Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan Island. In fact, let's see what the United Nations has to say about the matter. The United Nations considers Taiwan as a province of China with no separate status. And there it is, clear as day. And that's where the one China principle you would have heard of comes from. There cannot be two countries called China. So the vast majority of the world's countries, 183 to be exact, including the United States, the UK, Japan, and Canada, all agree that Beijing is the only China, and that the government on Taiwan Island is not. I even did some calculations. Only 0.48% of the world live in the 12 countries that believe Taipei's government is the real China. Taiwan Island is part of China, no matter whether you support the People's Republic of China or the Republic of China. Now, I talk about that all in my book, The Wu Mao Handbook, 20 Anti-China Lies Debunked, which you can get now on Amazon. I'll put the link under this video. Now back to the CNN story. The last statement that Beijing will take Taiwan by force if necessary is also problematic in that China's government has long pushed for peaceful reunification as a core policy. In fact, the tradition dates back to China's 8th National Congress in 1956, where it was explicitly stated, "We are willing to bring Taiwan back to the embrace of the motherland through the peaceful means of negotiation and avoid the use of force." If force has to be used, it would only be when all possibility of peaceful negotiation has been exhausted or when peaceful negotiations have failed. And as is being displayed during the simulated blockade of Taiwan Island, it's quite clear that even if Beijing decides to use force, it will most likely be in the form of a full military blockade without the need to attack the island with weapons. Now, China has risen massively in the past 4 decades, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty and becoming an economic powerhouse, all without firing a single bullet overseas. That's a stark contrast from the rise of the United States, which has only been at peace for a handful of years in its 249-year history. So you can rest assured that even if Beijing decides it needs to use force to reunify Taiwan, it will be more peaceful than you've ever witnessed before. And on that note, that will be it for today.
Shifting focus now, China has escalated the military pressure on Taiwan. We've been telling you about this. It has launched a second straight day of large-scale war games now, including live-fire rocket strikes in waters surrounding the island. The PLA's Eastern Theater Command carried out long-range precision strikes to the north and south of Taiwan. It claims all designated targets were hit. Footage released by the Chinese military appears to show rocket launches over the Taiwan Strait as Coast Guard and naval vessels operated close to the island's shores. The drills were codenamed Justice Mission 2025. And they represent China's most extensive military exercises around Taiwan. Live fire operations were announced across multiple zones, disrupting both air and sea traffic around the island until the evening hours. Taiwan, for that matter, has strongly condemned the exercises, calling them highly provocative and reckless. Taipei accuses Beijing of continuously undermining regional stability and the international order. It warns that the drills pose serious risks to security in the Taiwan Strait.
China has recently continued in the surrounding sea and airspace of the Indo-Pacific region, repeatedly through exercises as well as intrusions by military aircraft and warships, carrying out various military threats and gray zone harassment. Such actions fully demonstrate that China not only fails to uphold global and regional peace and stability.
And then reacting to the drills, local Taiwanese vendors also expressed concern as their baskets are running dry. Listen in to some of these reactions.
The intimidation of
Revolutionary salute to our family. Mac G69495 for the donation to the war chest. Revolution is a way of life. Absolutely appreciate the love. Soldier salute.
Effect isn't that strong for us. This isn't something new. They threaten all the time. China threatens any country it sees as a threat. With cross-strait tensions continuing to escalate, whether it involves live fire or not, we still have to trust our own defense capabilities. Beyond that, I believe Taiwan has many partners who would come to help us. This time, the message is clear. Apart from provocation, China wants to test where our bottom line is.
Now, the military posturing also comes against the backdrop of heightened tensions, of course, and the exercises started just 11 days after the US announced a record $11.1 billion arms package for Taiwan. That drew sharp anger from China. China, remember, views any foreign military support for Taiwan as interference in what it calls an internal affair. Regional powers are watching the developments very closely. South Korea, for that matter, has urged restraint, calling for cross-strait relations to develop peacefully through dialogue and cooperation. Seoul reiterated its long-standing position of supporting peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, even as it maintains formal diplomatic ties only with Beijing. China continues to claim Taiwan as part of its sovereign territory. It has never ruled out the use of force to bring the self-ruled island under its control. Taiwan, which is a vibrant democracy of more than 23 million people, rejects those claims and insists that its future must be decided by its own people. To stay up to speed with the latest news, download the
As this year is coming to an end, I have a really exciting announcement for you. In the new year, starting in January, part of my daily content will migrate to Substack and Patreon. And I'm very excited to start working on new interviews there. You will see more written content, and there will be more ways for you to engage, for my subscribers to engage. There is a subscriber-only chat, and I think it will be a lot of fun. It's a really great way to connect with like-minded people, to share your thoughts, share your perspective on the topics that we discuss. I think it will be a lot of fun and will be really, really enjoyable. I will include the links to my Substack and Patreon in the description box below this video. Make sure that you are subscribed, and I look forward to seeing you on those two platforms. Besides finding alternatives to the US dollar, the so-called de-dollarization, what else unites countries of the global south, and what is the BRICS bloc prioritizing now? You might be surprised to hear that a cohesive, joint approach towards AI, artificial intelligence, is now on the top of the BRICS bloc agenda. The global debate around artificial intelligence has been framed as a race. Who builds the fastest models? Who controls the most data? Who dominates the chips, the platforms, the standards? But something else has been taking shape alongside that race. A growing number of countries are no longer focused on winning AI at any cost. Instead, they want a seat at the table where the rules of the AI era are written, and increasingly that table is forming around BRICS. Now, unsurprisingly, the rise of BRICS as an alternative center of power, as an alternative center for AI policymaking, has triggered pushback from the West. Of course it would. And there are three reasons why. The first one is technological containment. As you know very well, because I discuss it so frequently here on my channel, the United States and EU have tightened export controls. They restricted access to advanced chips for countries like China, Russia, and Iran. The aim is likely to fragment the bloc and to nudge India and Brazil toward the West, while at the same time isolating China and Russia. The second reason is narrative pressure. BRICS AI initiatives are routinely framed in Western media as authoritarian or repressive, and so that narrative is designed to undermine the BRICS legitimacy among undecided countries. The third reason is competition through parallel platforms. Western-backed AI alliances and massive investments in data centers across Africa, Asia, and Latin America are meant to crowd out BRICS-linked projects, especially in countries that are still unsure of their alignment. The rapid advance of AI has collided with a transforming multipolar global order. And at that intersection, BRICS is emerging not simply as an economic bloc, but as a platform for building what you could call a digital belt of institutions. And I will explain why this is so important. These are structures that are meant to shape how AI is governed globally, not just how it is deployed. For BRICS, this is not primarily about innovation, bragging rights, not about bragging. It is about strategic resilience, about avoiding a future where technological power is unipolar, where it is unaccountable, and when it is used as leverage. With AI now being used in military technologies, this isn't just a game anymore. For many countries outside the core BRICS group, this matters deeply. AI governance is no longer an abstract issue. It affects access to technology, it's about economic development, national security, and also political sovereignty. Aligning with BRICS on AI is increasingly seen as a form of geopolitical insurance. It is a protection against a world where rules are set exclusively by a handful of Western governments and corporations. A major driver of this shift has been the unpredictability of American commitments in the tech sector. We're talking about a wide range of coercive measures such as export controls, sanctions, shifting regulatory demands, and political pressure, of course. This has pushed the world majority toward a strategy of multi-alignment. India is likely the clearest example of this. New Delhi is deepening cooperation with BRICS while also remaining compatible with Western norms. And in fact, India will chair BRICS in 2026. And just months earlier, it will host the Global AI Impact Summit. That alone tells you where the center of gravity is moving. This is the definition of a multipolar world. Over the past few years, BRICS members have reached consensus on AI development, on ethics, and on security. These principles are already reflected in joint declarations and in policy recommendations. The real turning point came in July of 2025 at the BRICS summit in Rio de Janeiro. During that summit, leaders adopted the BRICS Leaders' Statement on the Global Governance of Artificial Intelligence. This was the first attempt to tackle AI governance at an intergovernmental level that genuinely reflected the global majority. And unlike previous AI frameworks that were driven by Western initiatives and very limited participation, this document actually aims to establish universal and equitable foundations for future AI regulation, with the interest of developing and emerging economies, of course, effectively built in from the very start. In parallel, the entire ecosystem of BRICS-related AI institutions has already emerged, and this is so fascinating and important. These include the BRICS Institute for Future Networks, the Partnership for the New Industrial Revolution, Ad Hoc Digital Economy, and AI working groups, the BRICS Plus AI Alliance initiated by Russia, and the BRICS China AI Development and Cooperation Center. So together, these institutions form the basis of an alternative AI governance architecture. But the picture is far from seamless, of course, and there are challenges, and so let's discuss them. BRICS is not a centralized bloc. It cannot be a centralized bloc at this point in time, given how diverse politically, economically, socially, its members are. It is a coordination platform among sovereign states, which is why many initiatives do overlap. Transparency is sometimes uneven, and progress does exist, but at times it is very fragmented. And there's also a considerable imbalance inside the group itself. China, of course, accounts for the most significant portion of generative AI impact within the BRICS bloc. And then India, Brazil, and Russia together make up roughly 12%. If BRICS wants to achieve a unified AI vision, then there is a lot of work to be done. They need to expand joint research centers, they need to invest in shared infrastructure, and they need to support less developed members in that regard too. There have been several new initiatives this year, however. In November, Russia and China agreed to establish a joint expert council on AI cooperation. Then there is also the AI Success Hub with nearly 80 AI implementation cases from around 30 BRICS Plus and partner countries. So this is governance through practice, of course, not just theory. And yes, it does take a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort to implement these initiatives. As BRICS continues to expand, we're going to see more countries join AI governance initiatives. So make sure that you are staying tuned. I will keep you updated here on YouTube and on my Substack and Patreon. Thank you so much for watching. As always, support my work.
Our dear friend Colonel Wilkerson is here with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Good to be with you, Nima, especially since you're coming from Tehran.
Yeah.
It's awful dark. It's awful dark there.
Yeah.
You must
There
have
is
a
a
black.
monitor behind me that doesn't work. That I covered it with a little cloth there, and I'm trying to. But Larry, let me start with the attack on Putin. They tried to assassinate Vladimir Putin. I don't know. They were trying to assassinate to do something. And do you understand
They're gonna
what's going
regret it.
on in
They'll have to get
Kiev, in
demolished tonight.
Ukraine? Zelensky talking to Trump and then trying to assassinate, the president of Russia, who's the only reason that Zelensky was not assassinated so far.
I don't know whom to believe anymore on any of this kind of stuff. This morning, for example, I'm hearing from my friends that former colleagues, that the CIA hit Venezuela's port and took down some drug warehouses or whatever. Then I'm hearing, no, you know better than that, Larry. It wasn't the CIA. It was Special Operations Command. The CIA planned it, but SOCOM implemented it, which makes sense to me because that's what we've been doing for the past 20 years, really. But no one could give me any real confidence in what we hit. Maybe we hit a drug warehouse. Supposedly we did. Supposedly we blew up cocaine. I'm wondering about cocaine being at a Venezuelan port on that side of the country. That doesn't make too much sense to me, but none of this makes sense to me. So, when someone tries to assassinate another country's leaders, believe it or not, Nima, the first thought that comes to my mind is a false flag operation. And I don't mean in that sense that the Russians were trying to do it. What I mean in that sense is that one of the European intelligence bodies, even Mossad, for example, might have tried to do it and then make it look like Zelensky did it and heat up the war a little bit. I don't know how they expect to heat it up by killing Putin. I imagine they'd heat it up in the sense that the Russians would go full bore until they were at the Polish border and just wipe the rest of Ukraine off the map. I don't know. But it's silly to me to have these sorts of things. Well, silly. It's not productive, certainly for the leadership to be doing it on any of the sides, Europe's side, NATO in general, Washington, Russia, Ukraine. So who's doing it? Who, for example, is flying these drones over Russian tankers in the Baltic? Who is threatening to do this or that in Crimea? Is it really the warring parties, i.e. Ukraine, NATO, Washington, Russia, or is it other people playing in it? Because we've got that going on today. We've got that going on in Iran. We've got that going on in the Caucasus in general, but we've got it going on all over the place. And the other day I heard about some shenanigans going on in the Philippines. And the assertion was that the Chinese were behind them. The Chinese aren't behind that. Well, what good would it serve the Chinese to go fly some drones in the Philippines or whatever? So we got a lot of people out there doing things that are not necessarily in the interest of any of the so-called warring parties, to include Gaza. Now, I don't know how to interpret it other than we've got some extraneous actors out there who are trying to do things either for their own benefit or because they don't feel the war's going particularly in their direction and they want to get it going in their direction, or they want to stoke it or whatever. But that's the way I look at an attempt to assassinate Putin. Now, I wouldn't put it past the Nazis in Ukraine. Wouldn't put it past them a foot. but that assumes that they understand what they're doing, and it understands that they understand the conflict better than I think they do. So I can't answer your question. I don't have a crystal ball to tell you who's doing all this stuff. I still don't even know who shot Charlie Kirk. And I don't think the FBI has a clue either. I don't even think they're conducting an investigation of consequence. It's just, oh hum, we got somebody. He looked good. We got him. You know, we'll set him up for a trial. I don't think they've got the right person. I don't think they're looking. So where are we now in terms of these sorts of things? We're in chaos land. That's where we are.
Where is FBI in terms of their position? You know, the head of FBI
is in trouble, big trouble. Since Tom Massey and Kash Patel took him on, he's in big trouble. You see that 47-second delay on his answer? That was after he found out that Massey had a whistleblower who'd given him 100,000 names or files, I forget which. And Patel was caught completely off guard. 47 seconds he sat there without saying a word. Count that off. That's a long time to be in front of a congressional inquisition and to keep your mouth shut completely. And then when he did do something, he turned around and looked at somebody like, won't somebody bail me out? Well, that's a pretty hellacious question. 100,000 names that we don't know about? How is it that you're being open? Didn't we tell you to be open on this investigation? Didn't we tell you that if there isn't some real overriding legal or security reason, we want these names out? Look for Trump to do more stupid things because he's got to get this Epstein thing off the front burner.
Do you think that in terms of FBI, who is the upper hand? Who has the upper hand?
Well,
considering
Patel,
FBI?
I think it's Bondi and Patel, and I think Bondi and Patel, I'm going to have to revise my estimate of who's going to go first of the principal cabinet officers. I thought it would be Hegseth. I think Bondi and Patel are in trouble. I'm not so sure that that very circuitous, somewhat ingenious, somewhat indecipherable interview that Susie Wiles did with Vanity Fair's guy, or got published in Vanity Fair. It was the author of the Gatekeepers that actually did the interview. I'm not so sure that that wasn't to set some people off the scent. And what she did was she just deepened the scent.
Larry, here is Zelensky talking about, the Russian soldiers and the way they're preparing, or the current state of the Russian army.
They don't have successful things. We have to understand the number of their soldiers is decreasing because before this year, the number was increasing. They mobilized each month 43,000 people, signed it contracts. And this year, first time, the number of mobilized people and the number of losses the same. So this year, 2025, the first time when the number of their army they stopped increasing. So we think that the 2026, God bless, we will stop the war. Otherwise, Putin will decide to mobilize people. So now he has contracts because his nation doesn't respect mobilization.
Yeah. He tries to convince
they don't have
he tries to convince the American audience, the people in the United States, the public opinion, and then that Russia is not in a good position right now. How much of what he's trying to do is going to be successful considering the American audience?
Well, Zelensky's faced with two very stark choices. He can either accept the truth, which is that Putin has beat Ukraine badly on the battlefield, and take it from there, which probably means the end of his leadership, because I think one of Putin's also "I will not surrender" items is Zelensky has to go. There has to be a constitutionally elected leader of Ukraine. So that's one approach. You lie, you cheat, you steal, you do whatever you can to try and keep what is left of your support on your side and keep the battle going on. That way, maybe you survive for a little bit longer anyway. And the other choice is he admits the truth. But let's just examine that for a moment. If he admits the truth, then he's got to, at least concomitantly, he's saying, if not admitting, I've been lying to you up to this point. Because it can't be that I give you the truth now and it came to me in a sudden blinding flash of realization. Because you've known that incrementally over the last year or better. Now you're telling us you know it suddenly. So neither choice is very good for him. Were I he and faced with the circumstances that I'm fairly confident he's faced with now, I'd opt for the tell the truth bit and go from there and see what happens. But he's not going to do that. He's not that character. He's not that kind of person. He's the kind of person that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin and all the rest of the guys involved in this proxy war and this conflict rue the day of having in front of them, because in Trump's case, Zelensky is a better liar than Trump. And in Putin's case, Zelensky has no leg to stand on, so he's just nothing but a lie. And mobilization, I'm sorry. There have been mobilization measures taken before now. He's not just contracting soldiers. That's a part of it. But there is a part of it that's mobilization too, which is why his defense industrial base has been energized, because it's part of Russia's mobilization, just like it is most any country. Meanwhile, while we're talking about this, Nima, while errant intelligence entities are putting out things like the Chinese did this in the Philippines, or the Chinese did this in the South China Sea, all of which is false. What I've been hearing anyway about their messing around in the area. What is not false is that China is looking at Taiwan with a very, very jaundiced eye right now. And we are not paying any attention to this. And we're going to be surprised when suddenly one morning we wake up and China is in Taiwan, not in military force. They will have engineered a deal with the leadership in Taipei, because the leadership in Taipei watches us too, just as the rest of the world is watching us. And when they see things that don't give them great confidence in the empire's ability to fulfill its promises to them, let alone to come to their defense, they worry. And that's when you suddenly get developments that weren't counted on Monday. You get them on Tuesday within a moment that it happens. And we're not paying any attention to these sorts of things. Trump is paying the Pentagon, as far as I can tell, is paying absolutely no attention to what is really going on in the South China Sea right now, partly because look at where our assets are. How would you combine your assets if you had to suddenly deal with the eastern end of the Mediterranean? Trump has now said he's going to do Iran again. He said to Netanyahu he's going to do Iran again. Netanyahu convinced him that Iran is reconstituted, mind you, their nuclear program. It never was taken out. Maybe it was damaged a little bit, but it was refurbished pretty well. And that they're taking on modern missiles and so forth, and that the time is ripe and we got to do it. And Trump apparently said, yes, I'm with you. I mean, he came out and told the press, yes, I'm with you. We got to hit Iran again. So you can't figure this administration out from Monday through Friday. I don't know what their strategy is. I don't know what their tactics are underneath that strategy, except I do know now that there are dead bodies and flotsam and jetsam floating up on the northern shore of South America from the strikes. They've conducted so many. This administration is an enigma to me. It's a mystery to me. I don't even pretend to know what they're thinking anymore.
But when you see the attacks on Venezuelan soil, do you think that that would escalate, or they're
Oh.
going to continue with these sort of attacks?
I think what they're doing is precisely what I think I mentioned it to you, what they've been doing all along now for the last 15 or so years. They plant the CIA into a particular spot, and then the CIA gins up the kinetic action, the actual military action, if you will, for the SEALs or for some other special operating force. And then the SEALs or whatever Rangers go in and they do this sort of thing. So it's a combination of CIA planning, setting everything up, and then the executors are military when they come in, but they're Special Operations Command. They're not from Southern Command, they're from Special Operations Command. That seems to be what he's doing right now. They just blew up that warehouse or whatever it was in Venezuela, which really intrigues me because supposedly in that warehouse they found a bunch of cocaine. Well, my intelligence is that there's very little cocaine in Venezuela, that most of the cocaine, if it is in Venezuela at all, it's transit. It goes through quickly. And it doesn't transit by water. It transits by land to the Pacific shore, and then it's picked up and distributed that way. At any rate, I don't know what they're doing. I have no idea what they're doing, but it's dangerous. It's very dangerous. And now we have all this military force committed off the shores of Venezuela, and we have no significant strategic presence mission capability in many of the regions that we said 2 years ago were absolutely essential to have amphibious bottoms, a Marine Expeditionary Unit, or even a Marine Amphibious Group, a carrier somewhere close by with escorts, a carrier strike group. How are we doing that now? And now we're going to go to war with Iran too?
Revolution is war.
This president doesn't like war. Sorry. Doesn't look like that to me. Looks like he loves war. Looks like what it really looks like, Nima, is he loves killing people. That's really, I mean, you go back to his first administration when he killed several people, terrorist heads, leader of the IRGC, Qasim Soleimani, who was the guy he killed out in Syria, I think, Bugatti. He seems to like killing people. He doesn't like being accused of going to war or being a warlike president, but he likes, I think he even relishes killing people. That's what he likes to do. And this is perfect for him.
Is there anything in the Trump 2.0 that you would say is different from what it was before during the first administration? I'm talking about
Yes.
Trump 1.0, or we're getting to the same sort of conditions because the war in Ukraine is not that much changing. He's talking every time, no outcome so far.
But
China, Iran, go ahead.
I think it is different. From my perspective, watching it here every day, I think he's grown more absurd, more aberrant, more apt to do things that are totally contradictory of themselves in the same 24-hour period. I think he's losing it to a certain extent in his mental capacity to do whatever he has to do every day. And sometimes when I watch him, it looks like he's been stimulated. So what is he taking? What are the drugs he's taking in order to go from what looks like a very stodgy, almost flatulent old man to suddenly being fairly on his toes and speaking crisply maybe? Is he taking something? I don't know. When would we ever know in this country if someone was taking something? We're killing people for giving us the drugs, but we don't know when our own president might be taking something. And the other thing that troubles me about this second time around, Nima, there is a coincidence approaching with an economic collapse, the likes of which no American living today has ever seen. And this leadership. and this leadership's tendency to be authoritarian, particularly with things like posse comitatus, things like the Insurrection Act, things like martial law, things like deploying the military domestically. These things are going to coincide, and we're going to have a situation in this country, economic situation, that is the worst we've probably had since the late 1800s, and maybe worse than that, far worse than 1932, 1933. And that's the excuse for an authoritarian to put the troops in the country. Don't even have to declare the Insurrection Act. It's just martial law to keep people from doing the kinds of things people do when they're busted flat broke and have no prospects for the future. And Trump would be looking for that kind of excuse, and he has sycophants like Rubio and Hegseth that would like to do that too. And so we come down to the point where maybe they do really badly in the midterms, or maybe they just barely squeak by in the midterms. And then this crisis hits. It could hit before the midterms, but I suspect it's going to hit after them. What do we do then when we have no legislative check whatsoever on him? Very marginal one if we do. The Republicans are waking up to a certain extent, but then you got Democrats like my senator here from Virginia, Tim Kaine. He gets approached by Ro Khanna and Tom Massey and gets asked to help with this business that they've stirred up about Epstein, and Kaine turns a deaf ear to him. Tim Kaine will never get another penny from me. He'll never get a vote. He'll never get a penny from me. Where is the power to check Trump, particularly if we're mired in a situation that they also see as a threat to their existence in the legislature? Because, go back to the bonus marchers after World War I, that was only World War I veterans wanting what they'd been promised, but they marched on Washington. And they were pretty docile. They were pretty peaceful. Only General MacArthur made them look like they were aggressive. Very stupid act on the part of MacArthur for Roosevelt. But in this case, the excuse is going to be a lot bigger, I think, because this is going to be a crisis that affects the whole country. The only people it won't affect, essentially, and one or two of them it might affect too, but most of them is the billionaires. Everybody else is going to be impacted by this crisis. So that's perfect music for Trump, especially a destabilized, getting too old Trump who has people around him like the Tom Cottons, like the Lindsey Grahams, like the Josh Hawleys, like others, apparently like Tim Kaine, who are interested in controlling everything to the maximum extent possible and will relax constitutional restrictions and laws in order to do it. And I know I sound like I'm a pessimist, a predictor of disaster and that sort of stuff, but I think we're in real economic trouble, and it's going to come to bear within the next 12 to 18 months, and it's going to hit almost every American below the 90% level, and that's going to take some really good leadership to weather, and some incredible cabinet work to weather, a good governance process to weather, and we don't have that. We don't have that. Throw on top of that all the other things that they're doing, like these strikes in the Caribbean and like what, Haaretz this morning. Here's the headline from the online version. Trump's embrace of Netanyahu is a tactic that offers little clarity of post-war Gaza. You think? There's no clarity. He's still killing people. He's still killing people in Lebanon. He's still killing people in Syria. He's now angry with Erdogan. How long is it going to take before he opens a front there? And, where are we headed there? And they're all talking about the beautiful city that Trump's going to build there. And, oh, by the way, Netanyahu's going to move everybody to Somaliland. Do you think a single Palestinian is going to accept a boat ride or a plane ride willingly to Somaliland? This is where we are. And Trump has engineered, at least in part, he's engineered all of this. His embrace of Netanyahu. I love that term from Haaretz. His embrace of Netanyahu. When have we not embraced that moron?
I don't know if you watch this guy who's the former speaker of IDF. He does a lot of interviews.
I think
He
I know who
said,
you're talking about.
yeah, his name just escaped me, but
Yeah.
he said that Turkey is growing to be the worst enemy of Israel.
He's sort of like Jacques Baud in the sense that he tells the truth.
Yeah.
By the way, someone told me yesterday from Lucerne, or I think it was Lucerne, someone I used to deal with when I was at the State Department, that Switzerland is scared to death of giving Jacques Baud a passport or getting him back into the country or standing up to the EU or whatever. I said, why is Switzerland scared of that? You don't understand. Okay, I don't understand. A little pipsqueak hiding behind its mountains with a gun in every bedroom.
Yeah, it's a beautiful garden, Larry.
Yeah. They don't want to disturb it.
Yeah. What they're doing to Jacques Beau is unbelievable. I talked with him yesterday, and the situation is getting worse,
Yeah,
Larry.
that's what I heard too.
No,
He can't even go to the grocery store unless he's got an escort, I was told.
If anybody tries to help him and tries to buy something for him, they're not going to be able to even buy the stuff and send them to him because it's going to be it's unbelievable, what Europe is trying to do to Jacques Beau,
I don't think it's Europe. I think it's the leadership. I think it's the EU leadership and certain countries' leaderships, particularly Starmer. Starmer has turned into what I would call a Hitler in waiting, especially with regard to people's civil rights. He will not tolerate anything. I saw this morning that the young prince and the king got into a tiff. I'd love to know what that was all about.
Yeah.
Because I've always thought Charles was a throwback to Henry VIII, without the power, without the guts, without the courage, without the brain power. Charles is a throwback to 400 or 500 years ago.
Yeah, the role of the United Kingdom is not, is not positive in Ukraine, in the Middle East. They're trying to do, even at least for the for the case of the Middle East, they're trying to somehow pretend that they're against what Israel is doing, but after all, we know that behind the scene they're doing everything.
Yep, everything they can. They're still flying those reconnaissance flights, I'm told, sharing the intelligence with the Israelis.
Larry, today Netanyahu talked with Donald Trump. You've mentioned that Donald Trump was talking about the ballistic missile program of Iran being, he agrees that Israel can attack the missile program in Iran, and he said when it comes to nuclear program, it's going to be fast. Who does he really want Netanyahu to attack Iran? How much of what he was saying today, he was saying aftermath and during the meeting, was related to his position, to the midterm election, for example, to what's going on domestically in the United States and what's going on domestically in Israel?
The first thing I think, and I try to think this way every time I posit, whatever it is I'm trying to determine with regard to Trump, the first thing you have to take into consideration is they are becoming desperate over Epstein, truly desperate. They don't know how to deal with it. And they know, some of them know really well, how deeply they're mired in it. I think it was 27 or 28 or 29, somewhere around there, I know I'm close, people whose names you would know, whose names I would know, are involved. And they're evenly split. He keeps trying to claim it's all Democrats. It's Bill Clinton, he says. It's, but it isn't. It's pretty even on both sides of the political aisle. So that's terrorizing them. and it's particularly terrorizing Trump. And I'm beginning to believe, I didn't at first, I believe Tucker Carlson, I believe Judge Napolitano, and it's no slight on him to say I'm having a little bit of doubts now, because people who had known Trump earlier told me that just wasn't Trump. That, yeah, he does things around women and he'll pat their ass and he'll, do the kinds of things that he did in the first campaign, for example, when he made that statement. He'll do those kinds of things, but he's not the kind of person who would do the things that are insinuated having happened with some of these people with Jeffrey Epstein. I'm beginning to change my mind about that. I'm beginning to think that some of these people are naive, the way my boss, Colin Powell, was naive about people like George Tenet and John McLaughlin, Donald Rumsfeld, Condi Rice, and others. Not that was a naivete about their sexual peccadillos. This is a naivete about humanity and men in particular, in my view. Billionaire men in particular, powerful men in particular. So I think there's quite a big bunch of Republicans in these files. And that's why Bondi and Patel are lying through their asses about this. Trump knows that, or at least he knows enough of it to be worried, seriously worried about it. And then the other thing I think they are worried about, seriously worried, because Scott Bessent is not a fool, is the briefings that he's probably giving them, as I've mentioned before, on the parlous state of our finances. The fact that we are not going to be able to pay the interest on our debt and what that's going to do. And also, there is something breaking through from Tulsi Gabbard and others with regard, and yesterday I was asked, do you think Tulsi Gabbard is saying what she's saying because she wants to help Trump in the negotiations with Putin? Because basically, Tulsi is more or less saying the intelligence community agrees with our assessment of what's happening in Ukraine, that Ukraine is finished, that Russia's won, get it over with, get it on and get it done. She wouldn't be doing that, probably. I don't think. Maybe she's found some courage, maybe. But I don't think she'd be doing that unless Trump had asked her to make the intelligence as powerful as she could with regard to helping him get out of this mess in Ukraine. But at the same time, I think she's telling the truth. So this is a point where political needs jibe with the actual genuine intelligence.
Yeah.
So if that's happening, then she's countering with the president's support, tacit at least, many other of the cabinet members who don't want, and people like Lindsey Graham and Tom Cotton and these other brain dead morons in the Congress. So I don't know where we're going with that, though, because ultimately they're all going to be derailed by Epstein and what it does to the White House. And they're going to be derailed in a significant and long-lasting way by this economic crisis. So, I think it's anybody's guess how this, one person said to me the other day, how many times do you think in history you've ever had a crisis of the nature of the one confronting America today coinciding with utterly incompetent leadership? I said, well, if you're asking me about America, I don't think we've ever had that happen, not in the dimensions it's happening now. You could argue that we had that situation in 1860 until Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office, and then we had competent leadership. It's hard to even find a place in ancient history. People say Nero. Well, go back and look at the Western Roman Empire. Nero might have fiddled while something burned. I'm not even sure that's true, actually. But it wasn't in that bad a shape at that particular moment. In fact, it went on for quite a bit longer. This is really unprecedented, and it's certainly unprecedented in our short history, 250 years, whatever you want to put on it, colonial, national. It's unprecedented that we face such a crisis with such incompetent leadership. Leadership, Nima, maybe incompetence not the right word. I'm increasingly of a mind that the leadership intends what it's doing. And that's a whole different kettle of fish. Why do they intend on destroying the country? Are they going to pick up the pieces afterwards and be even richer? What is the rationale for this? Why would they purposefully take actions all across the globe that encumber the empire to the extent that its demise is sped up, is accelerated by at least 3 decades? Why would they do that?
Yeah, good question, I think. Larry, do you think let's assume, let's be a little bit optimistic about what's going on with the case of Ukraine, if they bring the conflict in Ukraine to some sort of an end, to some sort of settlement agreement, do you think that the military-industrial complex would replace the war in Ukraine with some other conflicts?
Absolutely. They're just salivating at the prospect of China. Salivating. They'd much rather have it be China than Russia, because they feel like Russia's come to an equivalency to a certain extent. They haven't been tested. Chinese haven't been tested. There are a lot of people, that asshole, I won't say his name, that 3-star general who keeps pontificating about China. They haven't been tested in the way that Russia's been tested. Russia's industrial base has proven itself. China's hasn't. China's is on paper, if you will, to a certain extent. I don't think it is. Personally, I don't think it's on paper. I think 6,000 boats in their deep water fishing fleet, a Navy that's unparalleled, submarines that are as good as ours, all manner of other things, including hypervelocity missiles that are better than ours. The only thing about China's military that leaves me a question mark in my mind is untested in combat for a long, long time. The last time they had any brouhaha even was with Vietnam in '79, I think it was. And they sort of got themselves, Vietnam had a battle-hardened army. Tell me about it. The Chinese kind of got their ass handed to them when they made that incursion into Vietnam. So they haven't really had a chance to get real battlefield experience, like, for example, the Russians have, or the Ukrainians have, or the IDF now, although the IDF's experience has been in murder, not really in war. And that's true on all fronts, Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza and the West Bank. It's murder, it's not war. So that's the only thing that would concern me about China, where at the top of their military leadership. But other than that, the military-industrial complex would love to replace the Soviet Union of the old Cold War days with China. Love to. Probably even mention it in board meetings.
Yeah. Do you think that Taiwan would be interested in getting involved in the whole?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think one of the reasons we have this deal that may be going on right now, where long range or longer range missiles are promised to Taipei, is that that's a negotiating mechanism for the current government in Taipei. They know that we won't have them to them for years. That's just the way we do things now. Taiwan is still waiting for things we promised them 7 years ago. We just don't have the industrial capacity to produce these things for ourselves and our allies and others at the speeds that we say we do. And Donald Trump's been lying to a lot of these people, or they're just accepting his, misstatements, because you can't get Tomahawk missiles off the production line at the speed Donald Trump's mouth runs, let alone some of these other more sophisticated things. You just can't get them off the production line. About the only thing we can get out that is a main battle implement, if you will, is all those tanks we bought out of the Lima, Ohio plant, because the line was going to go dormant. So Congress bought another 4,000 M1 Abrams tanks, and they put them up in the mountains somewhere to store them. But how relevant are they even, unless you take them to Ukraine and get the tinning put on them and all the other things that you have to, and then train the crews and how to look not for enemy anti-tank weapons, but for drones. So we can't make much, Nima, and we can't make it fast, even if we can make it.
Oh,
But the
Larry,
military-industrial complex would love to change that. They would love to change that. They would love to build things all across the country and get going again, World War II style.
how about Venezuela and Iran? How about these two cases?
I think we're going to get our rear end handed to us in Iran. I think Israel's going to get its state handed to it in a coffin by Iran. Venezuela's a different matter because I don't think we are stupid enough to put major forces ashore on the South American continent. Here's a proposition for you, Nima. Simón Bolivar was a long time ago. If we want to create a new Simón Bolivar, ask Lula if he'd take the job.
Yeah.
If we want to create that, just keep doing what we're doing. Just keep doing what we're doing. South America has a lot of people. It has a lot of countries. There's nothing in the world that says the empire can't so antagonize the leadership of the majority of those countries that they pitch together and say, no more, no mas, no mas. And we wind up creating a bugaboo in the South that we didn't need to create because of our stupidity. We seem to think that the rest of the world is still as inferior to us as it was throughout most of the Cold War. It isn't. It isn't. Now, there are lots of problems, and some of those problems we've forced on them, which make them even hate us worse, like climate change, for example, where they haven't contributed very much at all to the emissions, and we've contributed majorly to the emissions, and they're paying for it.
Yeah. Larry, have you heard about the Saudi Arabia attacking the UAE forces and their sort of weapons sending to? What is going on? I've never thought that there could be some sort of conflict between UAE and Saudi Arabia.
Nima, I have tracked this ever since we were major arms suppliers to Sana'a in Yemen, to the government at that time in 1989, 1990. And what you watch the whole time you're watching the Arabian Peninsula is the Saudis periodically trying to punch above their weight militarily. And they try to do it for all these internal reasons as well as external reasons, which are usually things like, wow, boy, if the Iranians close that Persian Gulf, close the Strait of Hormuz for any period of time, we'd need to have another way to get our oil out. Ergo, we need to build an oil pipeline from the Gulf over to the Red Sea. That way we can pump it across. Oh, we got to pump it across Yemen? Okay. Well, let's start a war and let's get everything copacetic so we can build that pipeline. And then they get all messed up with their coalitions. You know, the coalition of the willing in the beginning included what? The UAE. I think it even included Egypt, if I remember right, and Saudi Arabia and a couple of other those little countries. And then they fell out. Little Sparta fell out first and started its own campaigns. We got the same thing happening again. And I don't think the leadership in the Gulf Cooperation Council, and this was a problem we identified at Pacific Command way back when the GCC was first formed. You can't ever depend on that group because they'll be at each other's throats before they'll be at any enemy's throat. And it's true. And the Saudis are no exception to that. They're the least apt to do it precipitously because they know how bad a military they have. And I'm not talking about just the regular military, which is truly bad. I'm also talking about the National Guard, which is really a royal protective security force and supposed to be top drawer. It isn't.
Here is what Donald Trump said about Iran. He says Iran doesn't need those ballistic missiles. There is no reason for them. They have to behave. I suggest him to be, the head of the National Security Council of Iran and talk with him. He decides about what does Iran need.
If I'd have been Bibi and I was in the room and he said that, I would have I'd been itching to say, they need him, Mr. President, because of me. and secondarily because of all those people on the other side of the Gulf, like Saudi Arabia, but mainly because of me. You know what the Omani foreign minister said? The real threat in the Gulf is me. That's why they need them. You understand now why we have to attack them and take them.
Larry, there is something so strange going on between Donald Trump and you know, Netanyahu. Why is Donald Trump trying so hard to help Netanyahu? What is
Because
at stake?
Miriam Adelson has her hand up between Donald Trump's legs and gripping. And every time she gives him another $100 million, that grip grows
But
tighter.
these people just support Netanyahu, Larry. These people are only in favor of Netanyahu, and this sector of the government, this sector of the political parties in Israel.
I've talked to enough people to know that they perhaps despise Smotrich. They do despise Ben Gvir almost to a person. Even some of Ben Gvir's own people despise him. But they don't despise Netanyahu except in private, because they feel like they are in peril, and Netanyahu is the only one with the guts, the courage, the brain power, and the knowledge of the bureaucracy. God, it should be pretty deep. He's been there more than 20 years, not in the prime ministership, but in power. And they don't want to discard him. They feel like, Nima, there's 2 million Israeli Jews who have left. 2 million. That's a huge number of people. And many of them are saying things like, I ain't coming back. Or they're saying, well, you let the place get peaceful for a year or two, I might consider it. So the ones who are intent on staying, and many of them are Russian Jews, think about that for a minute, are absolutely dependent on him, because they can sense now, after the 12-day Beautiful War in particular, they can sense that Israel could be in peril. So Netanyahu, they're not going to leave him. If they had elections tomorrow, I think they'd elect him again.
Who's Larry? When it comes to Israel, do you think that Netanyahu would somehow dominate the whole system? Because we know that the judicial system is trying to be independent from the government. But after all, Netanyahu is trying to do everything in Israel to make, but after all, Netanyahu cannot stay in power forever.
Well,
They
I think
have to have some sort of understanding of the current situation with Netanyahu, because let's assume this way: he's right now moving toward South Cyprus and Greece. The main question would be, what is he seeking for in these two countries? They're not that much capable, and when it comes to the military power, but their land can be used against some other countries, or maybe
they can divert Turkish troops if Turkey feels like there's some threat there, then, or even just political problems. They can they can divert Turkish troops away from wherever everyone might be intending to use them that might be inimical to Israel's interests. But I think it's a tempest in a teapot for Netanyahu. It shows you how desperate he's becoming, that he has to go to Cyprus and Greece to try and find a counterbalance to Turkey. You must have really screwed up strategically, Mr. Netanyahu. Well, he has. He's bitten off far more than the IDF can chew. He's got too many fronts going on. He's got too little support to manage even 2 or 3 of those fronts, let alone the 5 he's opened up, and now possibly a 6th one in Somaliland. He just can't handle all that. So it's getting tough even for him, as adroit as he is at the bureaucracy of Israel, to stay up. And the only reason, as I said, that he is being able to stay up is because there's no one in the wings. You look at people like Yoav Gallant or some of these other people who have aspirations perhaps to replace him. The Israeli people know these people aren't even in his class in terms of being able to manage all the myriad problems that he's created.
Let me play a clip of Ursula von der Leyen talking about.
Oh, my favorite woman.
Yeah. Here is what she said, Larry.
Can't hear her. Let me turn my volume up.
Cannot hear it?
Uh-uh.
Can you hear it, Larry?
I'm reading the subscripts.
Yeah.
Is she talking about people like Jack Bogg?
Yeah, exactly. Let me just sum it up for you.
Yeah.
He's talking about not debunking the information, but pre-bunking. Going against. She argues that the society in Europe, particularly, is infected by misinformation and disinformation. We have to go against it, and I would believe that she's talking about people like Jacques Beau, and
Yeah.
who are
There are three or four
somehow
others. Yeah, there are 3 or 4 others too. that-
they're preparing the ground to go after other people in Europe.
Yeah.
I see that coming. And how?
This is
Why
a-
the what?
this
Why
is a-
do they need? Why do they need this at this particular moment? They know that the Ukraine case is going nowhere for Europe.
This is the ultimate outcome of people who built an apparatus ostensibly to be over the whole of Europe and maintain its democratic tendencies. It has done no such thing. It has put itself over the whole of Europe to the point where it goes down to some French farmer in the Dordogne region and says, "You owe me $14 for this EU tax on your sheep's hooves." But it is not maintained a democracy, because when they tell you that you owe those $14, you don't pay them, you're going to jail. It's a draconian organization. It's authoritarian, which is why you get people from the different countries wanting to be members of the EU Parliament, because they feel like in their own country they're not very powerful, but they're very powerful when they go to Brussels. It's an anathema. It's just not what it was supposed to be. A democrat, an institution, a chapeau over Europe that not only brought visa-free travel, currency commonality, and other good things, but it also stayed out of people's business in terms of what democracy should be. The people, demos. People forget, demos means the people. And it became an autocracy. And she is the ultimate autocrat. I wish to dictate to everyone. If you say it's red in the sky in the morning and I say it's blue, I'll put you in jail for saying it's red because it's blue. And I really don't care what color it actually is. It's been happening for the last 20 years. They're becoming more and more and more autocratic and less democratic.
But the curve of this sort of decision was like this, and right now it's going up like this.
Yeah. Well, they feel in peril now. They haven't felt that much in peril up till this Ukraine war. That's one, I will say, one positive aspect of the Ukraine war is it's exposed the EU for what it really is. A talking shop of people who think they have lots of power and want to show you they do.
Yeah.
And the people who work in Europe, the people who do the job every day, 24/7, the Germans, the French, the Swiss, the Finns, I don't think they like it either. 60% of them, I don't think they like it. That's why I say you're going to see some real changes in the governments. But then the question becomes, what do those changes get based on? And what does that do to even a somewhat decent unity in Europe? Does it fracture everybody? Do they all wind up looking like Europe of the 1930s again?
Yeah.
That might not be bad if they're all well-run democracies. That might
It's
not
a
be that
learning process for the people in Europe, in my
bad. Yeah,
opinion.
yeah.
Yeah, but they're getting to the point that this system is not working for them, it's working for the leadership in Europe.
And supposedly, many of these things that I was just talking about as pluses, like in '88, when I went into France from Germany, I had to get a visa, and it took 10 hours to get my visa. That was frustrating. Now I just cross the border, and I could take euros. At that time I had to take Deutschmarks. I guess I can take euros today. I don't think the Deutschmark has come back, but anyway, all of that was for business convenience, really. You might have felt like you were being convenienced as an individual, but you didn't need it. It didn't absolutely have to be that way. You could go back to a Europe that was not so unified, and it wouldn't have to be a 1930s Europe if you had good leadership. But who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows? Europe doesn't have a great history of getting along well. But the way to make it get along well is certainly not to persecute its citizens to the nth degree of the law for the smallest little crime on the face of the earth. Indeed, no crime at all. Jackpot, anyone? For telling the truth. You get persecuted for telling the truth. That's not democracy.
Thank you so much, Larry, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you for having me. And hang in there. And
turning up the heat, and this time the message is seemingly aimed straight at Europe. The Russian Defense Ministry has released video showing what it says is the deployment of its nuclear-capable hypersonic Oreshnik missile system in Belarus. The timing is hardly a coincidence. The images were made public just a day after President Vladimir Putin said Russia's stance will change on Ukraine's peace deal. This comes on the heels of Moscow's claim that Ukraine attempted a drone strike targeting Putin's residence in Novgorod, a claim Kiev has not confirmed. Moscow is likely to use these missiles at a former airbase in eastern Belarus. 2 US researchers have found by studying satellite imagery, Belarus now says the system will be operational by the end of this month, just days from now. And that has set off alarm bells across Kiev and NATO's eastern flank. This deployment significantly extends Russia's strike reach deep into NATO territory. Moscow claims the missile, which means hazel tree in Russian, is capable of Mach 10 speeds and near zero intercept probability. It is equipped with multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicle, basically an adversary worst nightmare. And the threat does not stop there. The question is what makes Oreshnik so dangerous? Flying at speeds of 12,300 kilometers per hour, it is stealthy and maneuverable, making it almost unstoppable. The massive range of over 5,000 kilometers puts several European capitals in its range, from London to Paris. This missile can reach in less than 10 minutes when launched from Belarus. The Oreshnik hypersonic missile is not just a theoretical weapon. It's made for combat debut in Ukraine in November 2024. Russia first used the Oreshnik missile against Ukraine by targeting a defense enterprise in Dnipro. For NATO, this deployment is a clear warning. For Ukraine, it is a reminder that Moscow is willing to escalate not just on the battlefield, but through strategic intimidation.
Today, we all share the same dream, and we make one wish for everyone, that he would perish. Everyone whispers to themselves. But when we appeal to God, of course, we ask more broadly. We ask for peace for Ukraine.
Days after this comment by Volodymyr Zelensky, which Moscow interpreted as an apparent death wish against Russian President Vladimir Putin, Putin's official residence was allegedly targeted in a massive drone attack. Russian authorities claim as many as 91 drones were involved, framing the incident as a direct escalation from rhetoric to action. The reported attack has now triggered one of the most unfiltered and threatening reactions yet from former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, who currently serves as deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council and is widely seen as Putin's closest political ally. In a 5-paragraph post, Medvedev lays out his anger, directly linking Zelensky's Christmas remarks to what he describes as an attempted strike on Russia's leadership.
Seriously, though, 2025 was full of all kinds of events, including really complicated and important ones. Our glorious armed forces keep pounding the enemy. Our economy, despite Western forecasts, is still in one piece, and the ruble is stronger. And of course, everyone now realizes that our victory is inevitable. This is the most important result of the year.
Medvedev then pivots sharply from year-end reflection to personal accusation, singling out Zelensky and accusing him of turning words into weapons.
However, I can express the only wish I have right now, and it's not a very pleasant one. A certain ugly rag puppet has recently wished death to one person. It's obvious to everyone that he wished death not just to one person, but to all of us and our country. He didn't stop there and actually authorized a mass attack.
While stopping short of explicitly calling for Zelensky's killing, Medvedev's language leaves little doubt about how Moscow views the Ukrainian leader's fate.
I'm not going to talk here about his violent death, even though the Grim Reaper is frequently breathing down the bastard's neck these days.
Medvedev then escalates further, wrapping his threat in dark satire and extreme dehumanization.
My wish would be of an entirely peaceful nature with a research purpose in mind. It is of paramount importance that the corpse of the green homunculus be kept in spirits on display at St. Petersburg's Kunstkamera Museum, where Russian czars put together a collection of deformed human anomalies for the amusement of future generations. This item shall be meticulously studied, since most probably it is yet another specimen from space, originating from a special race called Scura sordidus, which has come from the Tucana dwarf galaxy.
Medvedev ends his post with a profanity-laced taunt in Ukrainian, directly echoing Zelensky's Christmas address and tying Moscow's fury to what it calls a clear chain of intent and action.
So, as they say in their dwarf Tukana dialect, Zarostanim rokum puppet.
December 30th, and this is my only update for today. Yesterday, the Russians have claimed that Vladimir Putin's residence in Novgorod Oblast has been attacked by Ukraine. Now, the fog of war with this one is very, very thick, because the Russians are claiming that the Ukrainians did it, whereas Volodymyr Zelensky says, no, the Russians are making the entire thing up. So which one is it? Now, regardless of which one it is, what we know for sure is that this fits the pattern. What pattern, you may ask? Well, it's the same pattern that we have seen repeatedly each and every single time when the United States has conducted talks with either one of the sides. Let's call this incident a disruptor, something that's meant to disrupt things at key strategic times. And we've had plenty of that over the last 6 months. Now, with that said, we're going to take a look at the statement from Mr. Sergei Lavrov. Then we're going to go to see Zelensky's reaction. Then we also have one from Donald Trump. My friends, we have quite a few things to talk about. So let's just go straight to Ukrainska Pravda, the beacon of democracy. Where else would we go? And let's begin with Mr. Lavrov. Russia will revise negotiating position after alleged Ukrainian drone attack on Putin's residence. Lavrov claimed that overnight Ukraine attacked Putin's residence in Russia's Novgorod Oblast, probably Valdai, using 91 attack UAVs. He claimed that Russian air defense systems destroyed all the drones. Lavrov said that Russia's negotiating position will be revised, but added that Russia does not intend to withdraw from the negotiating process with the United States regarding Ukraine. It is difficult for me to pinpoint exactly what Mr. Lavrov wanted to say by Russia's negotiating position will be revised. It can mean either one of two things. Either Russia's terms for Ukraine will be much worse in the future, or Russia's terms will still be the same, but Russia will be far less willing to make any concessions to Ukraine. We simply don't know because Mr. Lavrov is very cryptic. However, I would add that it doesn't even matter, because right now the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine have produced very little results. I mean, yesterday we've had the Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump meeting in Florida, and after the meeting, both of them seemed happy. They both said that we are getting closer to peace, closer than we've ever been. In fact, Zelensky said that 90% of the terms have been agreed upon. Well, it surely doesn't look like it, and it certainly doesn't feel like it. It doesn't look like there's much progress being made in these negotiations. However, Mr. Lavrov now goes on and says something with maybe some impact in the near future. Listen to this. Lavrov also stated that these actions will not go unanswered and that both the targets and timing of Russia's retaliatory strikes have already been decided by the armed forces. Now, we can speculate for days on what these retaliatory strikes may look like, but let's not speculate. Instead, let's go over to somebody who already has an opinion on these retaliatory strikes. Let's go to Volodymyr Zelensky. Zelensky on alleged attack on Putin residence. Russia is looking for pretext to strike government buildings in Kiev. Quote, another lie by Russia. Obviously, yesterday we had the meeting with Trump, and obviously for the Russians, if there is no quarrel between America and us, we would have progress instead, then that is a failure for them. They don't want to end this war. They are only capable of ending it under pressure. And so they were looking, I am convinced, for reasons, and they are going further. It's very interesting to listen to Zelensky saying that Russia only wants to end things under pressure. I mean, you could have made these things. Let me contrast this with Mark Rutte. Mark Rutte always says that Donald Trump is the only one who can force Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table. Now, force implies what? Well, of course, implies pressure. So pressure is not exclusive to Russia. Then you have Ursula von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas, and many other people in Europe who always say, in fact, they make a point in saying this, we, the Europeans, need to keep the pressure on Russia. So again, pressure is not an exclusive mechanism to Russia. Everybody uses it depending on how the wind blows. Now, Zelensky is trying to present his meeting with Donald Trump as a major success. Look, Vladimir Putin from his den, he simply can't bear the fact that Ukraine and the United States had a meeting, as if it was a major success. But was it really? Yesterday, we've taken a look right at the beginning of yesterday's episode at a snippet from Zelensky and Donald Trump press conference. Zelensky didn't look too happy. In fact, he didn't look too happy throughout the entire press conference. So what exactly has been agreed upon? There were no major new announcements. In fact, they only said, we are getting closer. Well, that goes without saying. With each and every passing day, technically, we are getting closer to an end of the conflict. But what was agreed exactly that was so groundbreaking? Well, don't hold your breath on that one. Now, let's continue with Volodymyr Zelensky because he goes into detail about Russia's retaliatory strikes. Now, with this claim about some residents being attacked, I am convinced they are simply preparing the ground to strike the Ukrainian capital and probably government buildings at that. And that right there is what Zelensky thinks that Russia will do in retaliation. Now, I guess time will tell. But what I want to add with regards to the entire incident is that there's a reason for why people are saying that the ending of a conflict is usually the most dangerous time in a conflict. Because one of the sides, usually the one who loses, also loses their composure, and incidents like this, the disruptors, are not going to stop. In fact, they will probably escalate. And with that said, let's take a look at how Donald Trump has reacted. Trump responds to alleged attack on Putin's residence. Quote, President Putin told me about it early in the morning. He said he was attacked. It isn't good. It isn't good. Don't forget the tomahawks. I stopped the tomahawks. This is not the right time. It is one thing to be offensive because they are offensive. It's another thing to attack his house. It's not the right time to do any of that. Donald Trump is saying that now is not the right time for any of that. I fully agree, but I would also add that this is a massive understatement. I don't think there's any time that's right for things like this. Nonetheless, he's making a good point though. He's bringing up the tomahawks, basically implying that, look, can you imagine what would have happened if I, Donald Trump, would have given them Tomahawk missiles? And that's food for thought. I think this is his way of passing a message to certain people who consistently have pushed for Ukraine to receive Tomahawk missiles from the United States. Nonetheless, he doesn't stop here, he goes further. When asked whether he had received any evidence of the attack from US intelligence services, Trump said the matter was being clarified. Quote, you're saying maybe the attack didn't take place. That's possible too, I guess. But President Putin told me this morning it did, he added. Now that right there is an outstanding example of the media just doing their job. They're asking the right questions. President Trump, do you have any evidence from US intelligence services about the claims of Vladimir Putin? They're just claims. Now, you see, this is a beautiful thing. Asking for evidence. I love this. But the problem is that they're very selective with who they ask about evidence, because there's other people in the world who can say whatever they want. And I don't think there's a single journalist, at least not in the West, who will ask them anything about evidence. It's funny how things work. But one thing is for certain, when you talk about Vladimir Putin, you absolutely need all the evidence in the world. All the evidence you can get your hands on. Is never too much evidence, or you can get in trouble. Nonetheless, my friends, I mean, Donald Trump is also leaving the door open for the possibility that the Russians are making the entire thing up. So with that said, let's just move on to the next article. Kremlin claims Trump has changed position on Ukraine. Yuri Ushakov, an aide to Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin, has claimed that US President Donald Trump has adjusted his approach to Ukraine and to President Volodymyr Zelensky following reports of an attempted drone attack on one of the Russian leader's residence. The US has not confirmed this. Quote, the US president was shocked by this report, literally outraged. He could not imagine such insane actions. And as was said, this will undoubtedly affect the Americans' approach to working with Zelensky. So Mr. Ushakov seems to be convinced that Donald Trump is outraged, and therefore he will change his position on how he approaches working with Zelensky. I wouldn't be too sure about that, you see, and I'm going to explain why. You see, some people are saying that Donald Trump has walked into his own trap. He talked about these negotiations for so long, and he presented himself as the only one who can bring peace in Ukraine, to the point where leaving the negotiations is no longer an option. Leaving Ukraine is no longer an option. So no matter how much outrage he feels, I think he's compelled by the position he has created to actually, regardless of what happens. And this is not a good place to be in, I agree. But I wouldn't be so sure about what Mr. Ushakov is saying. Also, there was the press conference yesterday between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. And during that press conference, Donald Trump was asked, what do you think about the incident with Vladimir Putin's residence? And let's just say that outrage wasn't one of the things he expressed. Now, people will say, well, yes, of course, but what you say in public is not the same as what you say to Vladimir Putin over the phone. Absolutely true. However, we know that Donald Trump doesn't really hold back from showing outrage when he either feels it or when he feels it's necessary to show it. With that said, I mean, that's what Mr. Ushakov thinks. We'll see how things develop. But I wouldn't be so sure that Donald Trump will change his position on working with Zelensky. But that's just my opinion. Now, let's continue. Zelensky says Ukraine wants 30 to 50-year US security guarantees, and Trump will consider it. Quote, indeed, for now, this is not forever. The documents provide for 15 years with the possibility of extending these security guarantees. I raised this issue with the president. I told him that we are still at war and that it has already lasted almost 15 years. That is why we would very much like the guarantees to be longer. I told him that we would very much like to consider the possibility of 30, 40, or 50 years. That would then be a historic decision by President Trump. The president said he would think about it. There's two things I want to mention here. First of all, Zelensky says, look, if President Trump agrees to 30 to 50-year security guarantees for Ukraine, that would be a historic decision. Well, from where I'm standing, I think it would be a historic decision, even if he agrees to 10 years or 15 years, it doesn't matter. And the reason it would be historic is because this hasn't been done before, with regards to the United States providing bilateral security guarantees to Ukraine. So it's historic regardless of the duration. Nonetheless, now the second thing I want to emphasize is the 15 years. Zelensky is saying that this war has already lasted for almost 15 years. I mean, it's funny how that works, because that's exactly what many of us have said for years. But then other people said, no, don't you dare say that, because this war only started in 2022, completely disregarding what happened prior to that. But as we can see, Volodymyr Zelensky is now saying that this war has already lasted for almost 15 years. I mean, it's beautiful how things work out, isn't it? Now, let's go over to the Europeans. Let's see what happens in Europe. EU answer to Draghi's call for big industry rescue fund risks falling short. Talks are crawling forward on setting up a 400 billion European competitiveness fund. It already looks like it's a case of too little, too late. Hundreds of billions of euros short and probably already late. That's the state of play in talks on setting up a special investment fund to save European industry from collapse as a result of cutthroat competition from China and Donald Trump's US tariffs. There's quite a few things to process here. First and foremost, they're finally admitting that the European industry is in a bit of a crisis, and that's an understatement. That's to put it mildly. Then they're continuing by saying, look, the EU wants to set up this 400 billion EU competitiveness fund. However, it might be too little, too late. Well, who would have thought? Who would have thought? But then who do they blame for the entire situation? Well, of course, it's China and Donald Trump. Those are responsible for the problems in Europe. And I would also add, don't forget Vladimir Putin. He's also responsible. Throw him into the mix as well. You see, an industry doesn't go into decline overnight. It takes systematic bad decisions to get an industry overall, especially at the continental level, into bad shape. It just doesn't happen overnight. And Donald Trump's tariffs are something very recent. I think they came into effect during the summer. So what happened in the years prior? Does anybody want to talk about that? No, of course not. Don't you say that. Then let's look at competition from China. Yes, China is extremely competitive. But why are they competitive? Well, they have a few things different. They have a different setup to Europe, that must be said, with regards to regulations and other things. But China also has access to cheap energy, something that Europe used to have access to as well, up until very recently. So you see, it's either China that's to blame, or Donald Trump, or of course Vladimir Putin, but it's never the policy here at home, never that. It's interesting how things work. Super technocrat Mario Draghi advised the EU last year that it would need to invest 800 billion euros a year to bring its industry into the 21st century. Quote, "We should abandon the illusion that only procrastination can preserve consensus," the former European Central Bank chief and Italian Prime Minister warned at the time. But it's already clear that the fund will be smaller than Draghi envisioned. It will be unwieldy, and with Europe's industrial decline gathering pace, late. So Europe's industrial decline is not only a reality, but in fact, it's gathering pace. I mean, that's the takeaway right there. You know, if only Europe had more money to invest into its industry, right? If only Europe can have cheaper energy, I wonder what the outcome would be. My friends, I leave this episode right here before I go into a rant, and I wish...
Coffee. Follow me.